Hi guys, I don't know who is on at the moment. It's a little bit early, so I just wanted to set it all up. In the event that you want to come in and actually ask a couple of questions on the Zoom, please feel free to come in on the following Zoom ID and passcode. Hi guys, I don't know who is on at the moment. It's a little. Yeah. Okay. So if you have any questions, please put them on the chat. I have a list of questions that some of you have emailed in already. I will switch on my camera and everything soon. I'm just going to mute the mic for a couple of minutes. We will start at 6 o'clock sharp. So if you haven't, please make sure you've got a calculator. You will need pen and paper as well, especially for diagrams. So that's what you can do in the next 5 minutes. Hi everyone, welcome to the Macro Paper 2 Q&A. Those of you that have not had, we're not here for Paper 1, welcome, my name is Ahmed. I have had quite a few questions come through to me over email. So thank you very much for those of you that have sent over your questions in advance. If you would like to ask a question that I may or may not answer, hopefully I will in the 2 hours we have a lot of time to be fair. Can you please jump onto the Zoom? The ID is on there and the passcode is there. I am going to move this screen. So please note it down on a piece of paper if you can, because in the event that you decide later on halfway through that you'd like to actually ask a question, please hop onto Zoom and ask a question either in the chat or the Q&A, whichever is more convenient for you. All right, let's get started. Let's do as much as we can in the 2 hours that we have. So our starting point is, I had quite a few of you actually asking specifically about the concept of index numbers, how you calculate an index number, what mathematical equations you have to basically plug in. So before I actually answer how to deal with index numbers, I want you to understand how to lay out your maths to ensure you never ever get this wrong. So imagine the following scenario. I say to you guys, we have kilometers and miles. I appreciate that might be very alien in terms of what I'm trying to do. And imagine I said to you that for every 8 kilometers, there are 5 miles, right? Now, the important thing about this method is that as long as you keep the relevant terms on the relevant side, in other words, I keep all the kilometers on one side, I keep all the miles on one side, this method will always work. Let's say now the question asks you to figure out how many miles there are in 2,032 kilometers. Right, that face value, that looks pretty straight, pretty difficult, right? How do we get to this number? Well, the method is very straightforward, and you'll see why this is an important method to understand, because you can use this for base numbers and index numbers. What I need to do is I need to just make sure that we're always only moving in straight lines. We can never ever in this method go diagonally. In other words, I can never go from there to there or from there to there. The only thing I can do is I can go 2032 to there to there. 2 steps. It will always work. Step 1 is always to divide. So for example, I go 2032 divided by 8, whatever I get as an answer there. The second step always is to then multiply, in this case, multiply by 5. Step 1, divide. Step 2, times. It will always work. And it also will work regardless of which direction you go in, as long as you do it in straight lines. What I mean by that is, imagine instead, so if I rub it out from there, let's say this time I go, all right, 5 divided by 8, and then I multiply that by 2032. I would get the exact same answer if I do it in that order. This means that as long as I have 3 variables, I will always be able to find the 4th in this method. Right, with that in mind, I want you guys to see a past paper question to see what I mean and how we could apply this to index numbers. So let me unshare this and instead share the following question. Not this one, that's going to be in a moment. The one I want to do instead is the 2019 paper, I believe it was. Yes, number 1. Okay, so the 2019 paper from the Edexcel paper has the following data. It's got monthly additions to UK credit card lending in billions of pounds, 2015 to 2017. And then in the second question over here, it says, using the chart, calculate an index number for additions to credit card lending in March 2017 using January 2016 as the base. You are advised to show your working, obviously show your working. Right, okay. So I will share my screen in a second in terms of my maths, but let's note down a couple of important things here. So the first thing that we need to note down is the 2 years that we're comparing. So we're going to compare March 2017. So give me 1 second. Okay, so I've got January 2016, and I've got March 2017. Right. Based on the information up here, I basically have in billions of pounds the monthly addition to credit card lending. Now, they very nicely have, if you can see, put a really clear dot to tell you what numbers to look for. So in January 2016, the price, if you like, let's call it price, is equal to 13,000. And in March 2017, it's now 15,000. Okay, right. Let me unshare for a second and instead share my board so that you can see what I've done. So I've got this. I have the following variables. So I've said, okay, the 2 dates that I'm comparing are January 2016 and March 2017. And I know from the data the exact price in 2016 and the exact price in 2015. So far, so good. But importantly, the question also said, using January 2016 as the base year. So I'm going to have over here index. Now, what is the key feature of a base year? Well, a base year is always set, the index number is always set to the number 100, always. Why, by the way? Because it makes it easier for us to do comparisons. So for example, let's say in a given year, GDP was an index of 100, and then the next year, the index number was 102. By what percentage did GDP rise by? Well, obviously by 2%, because it's much easier to do that mathematically than like really long numbers. So you go 102 minus 100, 2%. Okay, look at what I've basically put together here. So I've said in Jan 2016, the price is 13,000 and in March is 15,000. But I know that the index number in 2016 is the base year, so it's equal to 100. So I now put 100. What I said earlier is I said, I need 3 numbers to be able to calculate the fourth using my method. Do I have my 3 numbers? Well, yes, I now have my 3 numbers. So I can do it in the following order. I said step 1 is we divide. So we're going to do 15,000 divided by, so step 2 divided by 13,000. And then the second thing I always do, so that's the division, is I multiply. And I'm just going to multiply that number by 100. Right, I don't even know what that is, but whatever that is, let's don't calculate it now actually. So we've got 15 divided by 13 times 100. The correct answer is 115.4. Do it to 1 decimal place. Yeah? Does that make sense? Hopefully, unless my calculator's done it wrong, but I'm pretty sure that's the correct answer. Yeah? That is how I always want you to deal with index numbers. So all you need to do is to understand that you'd lay it out as price on one side, index on the other side. And as long as you know the base year, they will obviously give you the base year, otherwise they can't ask this question. This will always work. Divide, multiply. Bear in mind again, I could have done it the other way. I could have done 100 divided by 13,000, and I could have multiplied that answer by 15,000. It would give you the exact same answer. If you don't believe me, try it. It will work. Cool? Hopefully that's a nice little easy starting point in terms of what we need to know. Now, the other kind of section A type question or small type of question that you can get in an exam that I've been asked about quite a few times actually is the multiplier. And how that might be examined, and in particular, what you need to understand about the multiplier. So, okay, within the circular flow of income, and the circular flow of income basically maps out how money changes hands within an economy, there are injections and there are leakages. You should know these like the back of your hand, by the way. So the 3 injections, we have government spending, investment, and exports. The 3 leakages or withdrawals means the same thing, are just the opposite. So the opposite of government spending is taxation. The opposite of investment is saving, and the opposite of exports is obviously imports, right? Now, whenever, for example, there's an increase in injections, that is going to result in something called a positive multiplier effect. Now, before I do the maths, it is actually very important for you to understand this concept because you can use it very, very regularly in your essays whenever there's a rise in the injections. So, for example, hypothetically, let's say the government have decided to spend £200 million in the economy. And let's say, for argument's sake, that all of that money is spent on what we call current expenditure, basically salaries, day-to-day salaries for like nurses, doctors, teachers, something like that, right? In the public sector. Those individuals now either have a higher income than they had before, or they have an income that they didn't have before. What will they do with their money? So I'm going to basically depict this with the letter Y to say, look, this is income being invested into the economy, right? Those individuals that have an income that didn't have an income before are going to spend some of their money. Do you agree? They're going to spend some of their economy in the UK. Some of it will be saved. Some of it will get taxed. Some of it, they might buy goods from abroad, but they will spend some of it in the economy. Let's say hypothetically, they decide to spend, of the 200 million, 105 million pounds. Now, what happens there is that this means that firms are now generating more money, and there is extra demand for their goods and services. Now, to cater for the extra demand, and because they're generating more money, do you agree they're probably going to hire more workers? Now, they're not going to use all 105 million pounds they generate on hiring new staff, but they'll spend some of it. So let's say hypothetically they now invest, or they use, of the 105 million, 60 million of it on creating jobs. I depict that again by the letter Y. Why? Because more income has been generated now. And if you notice, that initial injection, the government spending, has resulted in another round of income being generated. And the same thing happens again, where people have money, they're going to spend some of it, not all of it. So let's say they spend 20 million this time. Well, that means that revenue is going up for the firm by 20 million. They're going to then hire a few more workers. Let's say they hire 5 million more, and so on and so forth. Eventually, you'll see that a number fizzles out. It will eventually kind of evaporate, if you like. But ultimately, that initial injection of 200 million pounds did not just stop there. It led to subsequent rounds of income being generated in the economy. That, in a nutshell, is the multiplier. Now, you also need to know how to calculate it mathematically. And the rule for the multiplier is as follows. So multiplier is equal to 1 over 1 minus MPC, I will discuss what that is in a second, or 1 over MPW, which is the marginal propensity to consume. Right, first and foremost, the MPC here is marginal propensity to consume. Marginal propensity is a really, really fancy way of saying for each additional unit of income that you earn, how much of it do you, so if it's marginal propensity to consume, how much of it do you spend in the economy? How much of it do you spend, basically, right? So if I gave you £1 extra, how much of that pound you spend, that is your marginal propensity to consume. Now, mathematically, if we look at this, do you agree that the 1 and the 1 over here basically cancel each other out? So we end up with is a scenario where we go 1 minus MPC is equal to MPW. Fine, is that fair? And then if I rearrange that, so I can take this all the way to the other side, I end up with MPC plus MPW must equal 1. Right, this is very important to understand. That logically has to make sense. But before I explain why that makes sense, let's zoom in on MPW, the marginal propensity to withdraw. Well, the marginal propensity to withdraw is made up of 3 segments. And they are the 3 withdrawals, the 3 leakages from the circular flow of income will be your MPW. So to remind you guys, the first leakage was the marginal propensity to tax, so MPT, plus the marginal propensity to save, so people might not spend all their money. And then lastly, the marginal propensity to import, which we depict by the letter M. Fine. Now think about it. The reason why MPC plus MPW must therefore equal 1 is because the concept of marginal propensity is literally for every additional 1 unit of income you earn, there realistically is only 4 things that you can do with your money. 1, you can spend it on goods and services in the economy. Well, that's MPC. 2, the government might take tax on that £1 that I've just earned, so that will be the marginal propensity to tax. 3, I can save some of that money. I don't need to spend all of it, so that's the marginal propensity to save. And the last thing, number 4, is that I can buy goods from abroad. I don't buy domestically, I buy stuff from abroad. Well, that's obviously the marginal propensity to import. Is that clear? Those are the most important things to understand about the formula for the multiplier. Now, all you need to do really is to make sure that you know how to be able to calculate the multiplier by plugging in these numbers. So I'm going to show you guys a past paper question. It's a very easy 3-marker, I believe. And we'll work our way through it. So let me just quickly share my screen for, there's actually 2 questions that I want to show you, but let's start with this one. Right, so share screen, here we go. So this is taken from, I believe, the 2016 AS paper. And it says the following. In 2014, the Bank of England estimated the marginal propensity to consume of UK consumers to be 0.5. In 2014, the Chancellor of the Exchequer announced a £15 billion investment program into UK road infrastructure. Right, I'm just writing out the key variables here. So investment of 15 billion, MPC was equal to 0.5. Okay, cool. Right, using the information above, calculate the total increase in national income resulting from the £15 billion investment. Right, if you get a question like this on Monday, honestly, you are so fortunate. This is the easiest 3 marks you could get, and it absolutely should not take more than 1 minute to answer this. Let's go through it together. So I will share my board. So the key things there was investment was £15 billion and the marginal propensity to consume was 0.5. Fine. And it's asking us to determine the increase in national income based on this. First and foremost, investment, if you remember, is an injection into the circular flow of income. So there's going to be a positive multiplier effect. Okay, first thing I need to do is plug this into the multiplier formula. So I had multiplier was equal to 1 over 1 minus MPC. Sorry, MPC, which basically is equal to 1 over 1 minus 0.5, which is obviously equal to 1 over 0.5. Right, if my maths isn't horrendous, I believe that equals to number 2. Yeah? Plug it into your calculator to check. 1 divided by half is equal to 2. Okay, have you ever wondered why it's called the multiplier? The clue is in the name. You then multiply that number by the initial injection. So now you simply do 15 billion times 2 equals 30 billion. Make sure you remember to put the pound sign and make sure you remember to put billion or million or whatever it is that they basically quote their number in. That was 3 marks. Like, how easy was that? That is literally, that's it. okay? Bear in mind, by the way, just in terms of like the formulas again, just to make sure that everyone is really clear on this. If, let me say, the multiple choice says the marginal propensity to save has gone up, hypothetically, yeah? That means if that's the only information you're given, two things have happened. One is it must mean the MPW itself has risen because it's part of MPW. If MPW is going up, MPC must be going down. It's not possible for them to both be going up, right? So if MPW is rising, this must therefore be falling. And then it might ask you to determine whether that means the multiplier is getting bigger or smaller. If you're not sure, just so you're aware, just plug in random numbers. So like do 0.2 for the MPC and then 0.1 for the MPC as an example. As a rule of thumb, by the way, what will happen is always is that when the marginal propensity to consume is big, the bigger it is, the bigger the multiplier, which is partly why, by the way, when you guys sit paper 3, or those of you that have development on your course for Monday, if you're talking about developing countries, their marginal propensity to consume tends to be very high because they spend the majority of their income on basic necessities. So their multiplier will be enormous, yeah, which is kind of a good thing about like injections into their circular flow of income. Right, are we clear? Hopefully that's pretty kind of clear in terms of the multiplier, yeah? All right, cool. So let's move on to some kind of bigger questions in terms of like the essays and the 25 markers and things like that. So let's get the big elephant in the room out of the way. Everyone, I think at least 9 people have emailed me about this. So let's deal with it. If you are doing the edXL specification, but even if you're not, it's actually on, I believe, Educast, and I think it's also on OCR. The financial sector seems to be causing a lot of like pain, suffering, nerves. So let's deal with a few things about the financial sector and how you would answer a big question on the financial sector. First and foremost, a little bit of revision. With the financial sector, it's really, in terms of what you need to know, broken into 2 parts. The first is what are the roles of financial systems? And the second is market failure in the financial sector. That's the one, if they want it to be slightly evil, could potentially be a 25 marker. I will lay out exactly how you should answer that as a 25 marker. First and foremost, let's deal with the 5 kind of features or the 5 functions of the financial sector, the main things that you need to know. Because it's one of those where it could either be, I think, either a section A this year, like a small question, 3 marker, or it could be a 25. I don't think it will be a data response. I mean, it might be completely wrong. Partly because the other topics that are on the advanced notice for edXL don't lend themselves too much to huge amounts of overlap, but who knows? I might be totally wrong. Anyways, the 5 functions of financial institutions. Number one is to facilitate savings. So one of the main functions of a bank is to enable individuals and businesses to place their money in a safe place and then access it at a later date, right? 1. So by the way, again, those of you, for example, that are OCR, you need to link it together with economic development. Well, one of the big limitations to economic development is a lack of savings. The financial sector can really address that by allowing people to save. So that's 1. Number 2, the second function of a bank or financial institution is to facilitate lending, that people can go to a bank and they can withdraw or take out loans and they can invest it and do whatever it is. This helps people to avoid like what we call cash flow problems. So imagine, for example, if I get paid on the 15th of the month, but on the 10th of the month, I've run out of money in my normal account, my current account, I need to survive for 5 days. So I probably would go take out a loan, use my credit card, for example, and then pay it back once I've been paid. That's number 2. Number 3, the third function of a bank is to facilitate exchange. It's so much easier to buy goods and services nowadays due to the fact that it's easier because of like, contactless technology. You don't need to lug around large sums of cash now to buy goods and services. So consumption is likely to rise due to the financial sector. Number 4, and this is the one that I definitely want to address because it was, I think the very first question I got as email was forward markets, to provide forward markets. Right, let's pause for a sec. What are forward markets? A forward market is basically provided in 2 different kind of submarkets, if you like, commodities and foreign exchange. And the clue is why it's in those 2 markets. Well, both commodities and foreign exchange tend to be very, very volatile. The prices tend to go up and down like pretty dramatically, yeah? Forward markets are ways in which producers, sellers, and buyers can plan ahead. This is how it would work. So let's say I sell cocoa for a living, and I'm worried about the fact that the cocoa prices are so volatile that it's hard for me to plan ahead. I would now go and engage in a forward contract, whereby whatever the forward contract price is, If I sign that contract, that means I have agreed in advance to sell my cocoa at that price, and I am guaranteed that price, say 6 months down the line, irrespective of what ends up happening to the market price. So hypothetically, let's say the market price for cocoa in the forward contract is $5, hypothetically, yeah? If the market price 6 months from now has plummeted to $1, doesn't matter. I am guaranteed my $5. I am 100% getting my $5. Obviously, there's an element of risk as well, in the sense that the price actually could have gone up to, let's say, $7. Well, I don't get the $7, I only get $5. But the benefit of forward contracts is it makes it so much easier for a firm to plan ahead. That's the main purpose of it. So you know how when we talk about prime product dependency and the limitations of being, this is a great eval, because this basically shows actually forward contracts can be utilized to reduce the element of risk involved in that industry. Yeah. In the June 2019 paper, question number 6A, it was a 5-marker about forward contracts in foreign exchange. And it was all about, the extract was all about a firm that did a lot of trading. If you're a firm that does a lot of trading in the sense that you export and import a lot, the last thing you want is the kind of exchange rate flexibility, like exchange rate volatility negatively impacting your profit margins. So you would in advance agree to buy a certain number of, let's say, euros, or sell a certain number of pounds. Does that make sense? This makes it easier for firms, therefore, to plan ahead. So hopefully that clarifies what a forward contract is. Sometimes they're called futures. It's the same thing exactly. That's 4. Number 5, the 5th function or the role of the financial sector is to facilitate a market for equities. Equities is a fancy way of saying stocks and shares. So why would a company, for example, issue shares on the stock exchange? Well, they basically can now generate huge amounts of money. So let's say that if a company lists on the stock exchange, when people buy shares, they're basically giving money to that company, and they can do whatever they want with it. Normally it'll be for investment purposes, but they raise huge amounts of money doing that. Why would you buy a share? Well, you're hoping that that company starts to make loads of profits or is continuing to make profits, and you get paid dividends. Those are the 5 kind of functions of the financial sector. Okay, right. What I'd like you to write down, if you are writing this by hand, or if you're typing it up, is the following. In my opinion, the worst question they could possibly ask, but don't worry, we'll deal with it, is evaluate the macroeconomic effects of market failure in the financial sector. So evaluate the macroeconomic effects of market failure in the financial sector. Okay. Right. I have a number of questions on the chat, by the way. I will get through them and I'll come back to you guys as soon as I can. Let's just get through this first. I've got a list of things that people have already emailed about, and I will get to this pretty soon. Okay, right. The danger with a question like this is to delve into what I call story time, where you're like constantly just talking about something that's happened rather than addressing the question itself. So just to be clear, there are a couple of reasons why market failure could occur in the financial sector. One of them is that you might end up with a bubble. For example, if interest rates are really low, or if, for example, the banks are being really high, they're taking really excessive amounts of risk. The consequences of them doing this is that you might end up with a bubble. So just very quickly, I really highly advise you guys, at the end of this, there's an incredible YouTube video. It is not me, don't worry. Which I think if you Google, if you YouTube the financial crisis visualized, it's basically a 3D video. It is exceptional. It's about 11 minutes long. It does such a great job of explaining the financial crash. In a nutshell, though, what was starting to happen because of these assets called CDOs was banks were starting to give out what we call subprime mortgages. In other words, they were starting to give out loans to individuals that had no hope of paying back that mortgage. The problem then is that it meant, because they weren't doing proper checks, they were allowing anyone who wanted a house to get a house, the demand curve was shifting out dramatically for housing. If I very quickly draw that, what that does, so D1, S1. So imagine this is the market price, the average price of a house in the UK, when everyone who kind of is able to afford a mortgage is given a mortgage. But suddenly now, they decide to start giving out massive amounts of mortgages to even people who really have no hope of paying it back. The demand curve now shifts out pretty dramatically, like this, to D2, right? As a result of that, the price of housing now is basically inflated. It's a bubble. And what do we know about bubbles? Well, bubbles pop, they burst. Eventually, to kind of, a spoiler alert, but house prices in the UK and in the USA absolutely plummet, like crazily plummet. There are two things that we can therefore talk about. The first, the most important one, and this is the first analysis I would start in my essay, by the way, is I will be talking about negative wealth effect, a very basic concept that you should know from theme 2. So first analysis, if you like, the first point that you should be addressing in this essay is to say the 2008 financial crash led to a significant collapse in the housing market. The housing market bubble that was created through excessive lending and through excessive risk-taking eventually came tumbling down. It popped, right? Now, when house prices plummet, the consequences of house prices going down is that it results in a negative wealth effect. Right, remind me again, what is a negative wealth effect? Well, a negative wealth effect is where consumer confidence falls, because imagine that the asset that you own, so homeowners, the asset that they thought was worth hundreds of thousands of pounds, maybe even millions of pounds, is worth even, let's say, half that amount. Do you feel more or less confident? Obviously, you feel less confident. This therefore translates into really negative consequences in the economy, because if consumer confidence is low, consumption, the biggest component of AD, is likely to fall. If consumption falls, AD shifts in, you draw the diagram, you talk about economic growth falling, unemployment rising, you can flesh that out in enormous amounts of detail. So the first consequence, macroeconomic effect, if you like, of market failure in the financial sector is a negative wealth effect. It is very, very straightforward to do it like that. Is that clear? I'll deal with the evaluations at the end. Let's just talk about the analyses and different things that you could do. The second problem of market failure in the financial sector is the financial sector is so important, especially to the UK economy. It is the biggest driver of economic growth. It is the biggest contributor to GDP. It employs thousands of people. And so one of the questions they actually asked in the June 2019 paper as a 15 marker was whether it was appropriate for the government to intervene and bail out the banks. I might actually deal with that as well in a moment, but for the time being, the government had to bail out the likes of RBS, Lloyds, and Northern Rock. They spent billions of pounds bailing out these banks. The second analysis, really straightforward, is two things. One is that the government spending that much money resulted in a significant rise in the fiscal deficit in national debt. If you look at data, in 2007, the UK debt as a proportion of GDP, just really quickly, by the way, some definitions. Fiscal deficit is where government spending exceeds tax revenue in a year. National debt is the accumulation of all the unpaid fiscal deficits up to that point in time. Yeah. So debt as a proportion of GDP. So if I compare the debt value to the GDP value in the UK, in 2007, it was roughly around 35%. Fast forward to 2009, and the debt to GDP ratio has increased to 60%. It is currently, by the way, just below 100%. And we'll talk about that in another essay in a second. Point though is this, you go, okay, higher fiscal deficit equals higher national debt. And within that, there is something very important that you should make as a point. Whenever a country's debt is rising and rising quite sharply, you can bring in their credit rating. Let me explain how this works. So the way the government borrow money is that they issue bonds. This is one of the main ways in which the government can finance big investment projects. So let's say I am the UK government and I issue something called these bonds. In essence, what's happening really is that I am saying to you guys as the investors, look, would you like an asset that I basically will pay you back on? So what will happen is let's say that each bond is £100, hypothetically, yeah? You now are lending me £100. So if I basically sell you a bond, you give me the UK government £100. In return, you get a piece of paper that says, I, the UK government, pledge that I will pay you back £100 plus interest. Obviously, you want a return on your investment, so you're going to get an interest rate. Now, it is fundamentally important for you to understand that there is an inverse relationship between the price of a bond and the yield. The yield is a fancy way of saying the interest rate, how much you get in return. And the reason why it's inversely related is because if a country is perceived to be really safe, so if you look at an economy like, let's say, Australia or Canada or New Zealand, like really strong, stable economies, right? Do you agree that if you lend money to their government, you're expecting to get your money back? In other words, it's very, very low risk. So two things. One, firstly, if there's a bond auction tomorrow, so let's say the Australian government decide to issue some bonds tomorrow, would the demand be high or low? Well, the demand will be extremely high because people really, really trust them with their money. The price of each bond would also therefore be high, but the yield, the interest rate would be low. Why? Because it's a low risk investment, therefore you're not expecting to get a huge amount in return. Fine? Vice versa, if a developing country decided to issue bonds tomorrow, let's say Zambia decide to issue government bonds tomorrow, would the demand be high or low? the demand is likely to be quite low. The price of each bond, therefore, is also likely to be quite low. And as a result, the interest rate, the yield, is likely to be high, because in order for them to entice you, to get you to take that risk, they have to offer you a higher reward. That is very important to understand. So in terms of the essay, again, to go back to this, I just said, look, the government had to bail out these banks and paid billions bailing out these banks. As a consequence of that happening, the fiscal deficit shot up. National debt as a percentage of GDP went flying high into the sky. This may result in a credit rating downgrade. Credit rating agencies, by the way, are institutions that indicate to investors how safe that country's bonds are, how likely it is that you're going to get your money back. Now, the top rating, you only really need to know the top rating. The top rating is called AAA. You don't write the word triple, you just write it out like this, 3 A's side by side, okay? In 2012, the UK lost the AAA rating for the first time since the 1970s. And in theory, this is what will happen. It didn't really, it doesn't matter. What in theory would happen is that if you get downgraded in your terms of your credit rating, the demand for your bonds are likely to go down. Therefore, the price of your bonds are also going to go down, but the yield, the interest rate on your bonds goes up. This increases the cost of borrowing for the UK government, and therefore it makes it harder for them to service, fancy way of saying pay off, future debts. This is such a strong chain of reasoning, by the way. And I guarantee you it will come up in some capacity on Monday, because I think the extract's going to be about the UK government. I might be completely wrong, but that the UK government and the furlough scheme and how they basically intervened in the market, if not them, another country intervening in their market to try and basically save businesses and things like that. And that would have resulted, like the furlough scheme, and the fiscal deficit went up a lot. National debt as a percentage of GDP has gone up a lot. Therefore, one of your points easily now is to go, therefore, credit rating downgrade, less demand for bonds, lower price per bond, higher yield per bond. This increases the cost of borrowing for the government, making it harder for them to service, basically pay off future debts. Is that clear? So the second analysis, if I was doing this essay, would be to talk about the fact that the government bailing out these banks resulted in a massive increase in the fiscal deficit and national debt. Within that point, because 25 markers is about debt, there is already a lot of depth there. There's a very, very important concept that you should probably incorporate into that, or even could be its own analysis, by the way. It's another form of market failure in the financial sector, and it is a concept known as moral, I don't know where my M's gone, there is, moral hazard. What is moral hazard? Moral hazard is the idea that banks, in this case, or countries, if it's like debt relief, when they get bailed out, it becomes an expectation that they will get a bailout again in the future. So if, for example, we're dealing with this in terms of economic development, if a country was given debt relief, so let's say they had loads of debt owed to institutions like the World Bank, other countries, bondholders, whoever, and then everyone decided, or enough people decided, you don't need to pay us back, don't worry, it's fine, cancel the debt. The problem that arises is moral hazard, because those countries might start to think, okay, do you know what? If we pursue irresponsible policies and accumulate high levels of debt again, it's not a problem. These guys are going to let us off again. It's not a problem. So it's an expectation that it will happen again, and that leads to them taking more risk. In the case of banks, repeatedly throughout that time on the news, it was constantly said, the banks are too big to fail. The banks are too big to fail. That's a problem. The fact that they know that they're too big to fail, and it's evidenced by the fact that the government saved the banks, suggests that they know they can get away with taking on enormous amounts of risk again. And that is a really important point. That is why it could lead to like another market failure in the future, because these banks think it's fine, doesn't matter. The government are going to bail us out anyway, so it's okay. Yeah. Those are a couple of the analyses points that you can make for an essay like this. In terms of the evaluations, a lot of it is to do with things like what happened, what was the government reaction, how did it, for example, start to stimulate growth, did it impact the bond market, as an example. So if our first analysis was about housing markets and the collapse of the housing market and confidence, well, two things happened simultaneously in 2009 to offset this. So the financial sector, when there's market failure, there's a huge issue here, but there is a way of rectifying it. Two things happened. The first is the Bank of England cut the base rate from 5% all the way down to what was then a record low of 0.5%. Now, this is actually a topic that is on the advanced notice as well, and it's important that you know how to answer questions on monetary policy. Quite probable, by the way, that it gets asked. When they cut the base rate to 0.5%, at least in theory, what should happen? Well, commercial banks, when they cut their interest rates, it took a while, but they did eventually. When the commercial banks cut their interest rates, there are a few kind of chains of reasoning for you to consider with regards to low interest rates and the impact on aggregate demand. One, When interest rates are low, are individuals more or less likely to save? Well, think about how savings work. You know, when I put money in a bank, basically I'm lending money to the bank. You know, the bank doesn't just sit there waiting for you to come back, right? They invest that money, they lend it out, they make more money on your money. Yeah. Therefore, in order for them to entice you to use their bank, let's say Santander rather than NatWest or Barclays or whoever, they offer interest rate. They all offer interest rates. Their interest rates are very similar and they're very low right now. So in essence, when I'm saving money, I am basically lending money to the bank, and in return, I'm getting an interest. So if interest rates are really low in the economy, am I going to want to save or not want to save? Well, I'm not bothered. It's not a big deal for me. So as a consequence of that, I'm going to save less because the rate of return is unattractive. And instead, I will consume. So consumption is likely to be rising. Yeah. Second question is, if you have a low interest rate, are people more or less likely to borrow money? Well, they're more likely to borrow money because it's cheaper to borrow money. As a consequence, consumption is going to go up. Fine. The last, by the way, in terms of interest rates, a really sophisticated point is there's a type of mortgage called a tracker mortgage. Now, without laboring this point and without overly plugging myself, on our YouTube channel, if you search our monetary policy, it's like an 18-minute video. I go through this in a lot more detail, but in a nutshell, people on a tracker mortgage, their interest payments are linked to the Bank of England's base rate. So if the interest rate is now cut, those people on a tracker mortgage suddenly find themselves in a position where they're having to pay a lower interest rate. Therefore, they have more disposable income. If they have more disposable income, consumption again goes up. Fine. All of this translates into consumption rising and AD shifting out. As a consequence of that, maybe the negative impact of house prices collapsing could be offset by monetary policy. And also, by the way, fiscal policy. The government under Gordon Brown at the time adopted expansionary fiscal policy. They were spending to try and stimulate growth in the economy. The evaluation then here becomes, okay, what could you do to try and combat the negative impact of the financial sector going basically collapsing, yeah, or the negative impacts of it? Is that fine? Second evaluation, in terms of like the bond market and in terms of like the fiscal deficit and national debt, things like that, there are two evaluations here. One is eventually the government sold, like Northern Rock as an example, was sold to Virgin, and they recouped a lot of their money. For example, with Lloyd's, the government claim anyway, that they made back almost every single penny that they paid for the bailout of Lloyd's. So maybe it was just a temporary rise in the fiscal deficit and national debt, and actually the economy might start to go back to normality. Plus, in 2010, under David Cameron and George Osborne, they started adopting austerity. Austerity is big cuts to government spending and higher taxes. So again, the national debt could start to come down. The government could address this. It's not the end of the world. They can address this. So even though market failure was caused, they can still rectify it through fiscal policy. Is that clear? Now, I purposely haven't labored this too much. Hopefully that gives you like a good outline. Because I've written this essay for you. So I will show you guys at the end of the course or the end of the Q&A where to access it. Now, when I wrote this, it was a number of years ago, and it was actually written as if it was written for a paper 3 exam. So it was the microeconomic and macroeconomic effects of market failure. I've written substantially more points than you ever need to do. You only need to do 2 analyses in depth and 2 evaluations. But you can like look through that and then address it from a macro lens entirely. That could genuinely be the 25 marker this year, possibly. I don't know. So it's worth making sure that you know how to answer that question as well. Hopefully that gives you a bit of clarity though, in terms of the financial sector and how to approach a question like that. And that it isn't the worst question in the world. It's not the nicest, but it's not the worst question in the world. Yeah. Okay, right. Really quickly, since we're on the financial sector, just so that we properly cover it now. The June 2019 paper, in fact, you know what? Let me actually show you guys the paper itself so that you know what I'm talking about. Here we are. So, share screen. Here we go. So the June 2019 paper, paper 2, the 15 marker was this. Discuss whether providing substantial government financial support to banks is the best policy response during a financial crisis. Okay. A lot of people really struggled with this question, and I understand why. This is not a nice question. However, you guys can be clever and manipulate the question to make it easier to answer. Let me explain what I mean by that. What I would do if I was answering this is I would go, okay, let's go through the scenario where the government did not bail out the banks. Let's say the government allowed the banks to collapse. What would have happened? And if I can explain the catastrophic impact of that, Do you agree at the end of the paragraph, after going through basically like Armageddon, oh my God, all of these bad things are gonna happen, right? I could just wrap it up by going, given this, it was necessary for the government to intervene. They needed to bail them out. Like they absolutely could not let this happen. That is how you should have approached that question. So for example, really quickly as a summary of this answer, the first thing that I'll be talking about is if they had allowed the banks to fail, if they had allowed the likes of RBS and Lloyds to go bankrupt, what would happen to savers' savings? What would happen to people's savings, basically? Well, the majority, if not all of it, just disappears. Imagine the bank that you bank with suddenly collapses tomorrow. Your savings, bye-bye. How will that affect consumer confidence in the economy? Well, consumer confidence will go on the floor, right? Consumer confidence will be so low at that point, not in many ways, but in terms of the financial sector as well, long term, but also like just in terms of general confidence, consumption is going to absolutely plummet. AD therefore is going to shift inwards. There's going to be negative economic growth, so severe that it's probably not even just the recession. It's probably going to result in, guys know what the more extreme version of a recession is? If you're really sad, it's depression, right? A prolonged recession is a recession, is the depression. Okay, now that I've basically gone through that scenario, do you agree that, yeah, the government, they probably needed to bail them out? You go, oh yeah, you know what? Fair enough. They needed to bail them out. Therefore, it was the best policy response during the financial crisis. That's my first analysis. My first evaluation is to go, oh, but it creates moral hazard, because now the banks have an expectation that if they take on excessive risk, the government are going to come there and save them again. Therefore, in the long run, this might be really problematic because it could lead to another market failure in the financial sector. That's one half of the essay. The other half of the essay. Remember earlier, I talked about the functions of the financial system. One of the functions is to facilitate lending, to enable businesses to take out loans. Well, if several banks have collapsed, two things are going to happen. One is now there are less banks for me to go and borrow money from as a business, right? That is likely to translate in interest rates going up, right? It's going to be harder for businesses to access credit when there are fewer banks. And if it's the case that it's harder for you to lend, it means the level of investment in the economy is likely to go down. Investment is not only just a component of AD, it also impacts big time LRIS. So you could talk about negative implications in terms of aggregate demand and long term as well, the AS curve. That's the second analysis, easy peasy. So again, by the way, I wrap it up by going, oh, therefore they have to intervene. They need to save these banks. They can't allow this to happen. The evaluation to that is the intervention by the government resulted in the fiscal deficit going through the roof. National debt therefore went up. The UK therefore get a downgrade in their credit rating. They did. As a result, the demand for UK government bonds might go down. The price of UK government bonds down. The interest rate, the yield on government bonds up. This makes it harder for the UK government to service future debts. And this is therefore a problem. And you get 15 out of 15. Voila, easy peasy. Yeah. I appreciate, by the way, that is not easy. I will tell you guys when I think a question is easy, when I think this is not easy. But it's just you being clever in terms of how you answer the question. You go, okay, what would be the consequences if they didn't do this thing? And if it's really bad, I can talk about that. And then at the end, just go, therefore, they need to save them. Does that make sense? Hopefully that's pretty clear, I hope. Right, let me go through a couple of things on the chat. There are a few topics that I wanted to basically address. I've addressed quite a few of them already. Okay, the first question, this is a pretty probable question, I guess, especially in light of the advance notice, is evaluate the effectiveness of macroeconomic policies during the COVID pandemic. Okay, for those of you that are edXL, you are very lucky because on our website, when you go on the past papers segment of the website, I'll actually show you guys really quickly. So when you go on this, you are now getting a pop-up that started appearing since yesterday, which is basically our guide written by myself of what I would advise you do in terms of revision, a couple of predicted questions, a couple of like past paper questions that I think are really useful for you to do. Make sure you download that. One of the questions I put on the pack is this one, is evaluate the effectiveness of macroeconomic policies during the COVID pandemic, 25 marks. Okay, let's address that particular question and how I want you to structure it if that is a question that comes up. So macroeconomic policies, by the way, is very, very broad, which is good. There are three macroeconomic policies that you can use. They're kind of like your toolkit. You've got two demand side policies, fiscal and monetary. And the third macroeconomic policy that you could talk about is supply side policies, okay? Be warned though, from time to time, they ask questions which say government policies. They go, which government policies could be used to achieve whatever, yeah, to do this, and probably be economic growth, yeah? If it says government policies, of the three that I just listed, which one becomes invalid? The one that becomes invalid, but sometimes the mark scheme is lenient enough that they still credit it, but I would not risk it if I were you, is monetary policy. Because monetary policy is not the government. Monetary policy is the central bank. Therefore, if the question is framed as government policies, fiscal and supply side are your only two options. If, on the other hand, it's macroeconomic policies, which would be a lot nicer, they're all in. Let's start with ours. Macroeconomic policies to address the COVID pandemic and how the government could have reacted, or the central bank. What I want you guys to do in the 25 mark and the big questions in your exam, spend a couple of minutes planning it, just 2 or 3 minutes, just jotting down the key points. Know what your first analysis is, what your first evaluation is, and so on and so forth. Once you've done that, my recommendation is always, in the big essay, to start with your best point. Start with the thing that you know is so impressive, because it anchors in the mind of the examiner that this is a capable candidate. That's not to say you chat absolute nonsense after that point, but actually you'll probably be given subconsciously the benefit of the doubt if your starting point is so strong. This is what we're going to do. After we define and give a little kind of introduction, just define like maybe demand side policies and explain, briefly the COVID pandemic resulted in consumer confidence being really low, consumption falling, and negative implications for the economy at large. Yeah. I would start, if I were you guys, with monetary policy. And the reason why isn't actually necessarily because of the analysis, is because the evaluation is insanely good. So let's do it. I would say that the first thing the central bank did is they had to cut the interest rate. Now, there are two different names that you need to be aware of to describe cuts to interest rates in terms of what that is in monetary policy terms. The first term is the formal term, which is expansionary monetary policy, right? Expansionary is a fancy way of saying any demand side policy that shifts AD to the right, outwards. Okay, so expansionary fiscal is where the government spend more money or tax less. Expansionary monetary policy is where they cut the interest rate, shifts AD out. Yeah. The other term, in the event that you see this in the data response, so that you're not confused by what this means, is loose policy. Right. The way to think of loose and tight policy is, imagine you've got purse strings. Yeah. When they're loose, that means you're freely spending. In other words, if interest rates are low, do you agree that people are going to save less and spend, right? Loose fiscal policy then is when the government is spending loads of money and they're reducing taxes so people have more money to spend. The opposite of loose is if the purse string is tight, right? The consequences of that is interest rates are going to be high, so people are not spending, they're saving. And if it's tight fiscal policy, that would mean the government are cutting back on spending and raising taxes, so people are spending less in the economy. Clear? So in the event that you see this, for example, June 2017, paper 2, 6E, has a question about loose fiscal policy. And a lot of people were like, what's loose fiscal policy? Loose fiscal policy means the government is spending more or taxing less. Cool? Right, now that we've addressed that, this is how you answer this question. The starting point is to go, one macroeconomic policy that could be used to stimulate growth during the pandemic is expansionary monetary policy. Full stop. Yeah? Now, this is where your real world knowledge comes into effect. You should hopefully know, you lived through it, so hopefully you know this, that the Bank of England during the pandemic cut their base rate to a record low. It's never ever been this low, of 0.1%. They cut the base rate to 0.1% in an attempt to try to stimulate growth in the economy. Once I say that they cut their base rate to 0.1%, this is always how you deal with monetary policy analyses. Aggregate demand, you should all know, is made up of C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Agreed? On the mark scheme, whenever they have questions about monetary policy, they always talk about something called the transmission mechanism. Transmission mechanism really is just a fancy way of saying what happens to the components of aggregate demand. And now, if it's a question where it's only going to be one of my analyses, rather than the entire question being about monetary policy, then I would focus my energy on just consumption and maybe investment as a 25 marker. I'd combine them together. So let's deal with that. Let's start with consumption. Again, by the way, that video that I spoke about earlier, the 18-minute video of monetary policy, you really need to watch that video. It lays out exactly how you answer a question on monetary policy. But anyways, the 3 questions that I asked earlier to remind you guys that you ask yourself in the exam that enables you to develop this in real detail. Number 1, when interest rates are low, are people going to save or not save? Well, there's less incentive to save because I don't get as much in return. So savings will go down. And as a result, consumption is going to go up. That's the first question, or that's the first kind of chain of reasoning. The second thing that I could talk about in terms of consumption is when interest rates are low, are people going to borrow more money or less money? Well, the interest rate is the cost of borrowing. It's the amount of money that I have to pay back on top of a loan. Well, if it's cheaper to borrow money now, because the cost of borrowing is lower, I will borrow more money. I will therefore spend more. I will engage in more what we call credit transactions. So I will use my credit card more, because remember, a credit card is not your money, right? Therefore, you think, okay, it's okay, I can use this more often because the amount I have to pay back isn't substantial. So the second thing we have is credit purchases up. And again, therefore, consumption obviously also goes up, right? Sorry about my wonky arrows. The last question in relation to interest rates being low is those individuals on a tracker mortgage, otherwise known as a variable mortgage, are they paying a higher amount or a lower amount each month? Well, interest rates are low, a lower amount. Do they therefore have more or less disposable income? They have more disposable income. As a result, do they spend more or less? Obviously, they spend more, right? So mortgages, basically. So just remember mortgages and then develop it like that way, yeah? Can you see, by the way, in all three of those questions that I asked, the same thing happened to consumption. Consumption went up every single time. That should always happen, by the way. If it doesn't, something has gone wrong. You've not done it right, okay? So that is our starting point. Now, if you're running out of time, if you find yourself in a situation where you think, I don't have enough time to write more than that, that is actually pretty sufficient for analysis. Obviously, then now, sorry, I'm wrong. You now need to talk about aggregate demand and the shift, and we'll draw it in a second. But in the event that you had a bit of time, I would also then talk about investment. Now, investment from now on, I want you to think of it as firms necessarily needing to borrow money in order for them to buy or invest into new capital machinery. Well, if interest rates are low, are firms going to borrow more or less money? Well, interest rates being low means the cost of borrowing for firms is low. They'll borrow more money. Therefore, they'll invest more. So now we've basically said that both consumption is going to rise and investment is going to rise. Then we go, both consumption and investment are components of AD, and thus a rise in consumption and investment is likely to cause AD to shift outwards. Bonus point though. Remember earlier, right at the beginning of this Q&A session, I talked about the 3 injections and 3 leakages. One of the injections was investment. The moment any of the investments, or so any of the injections are going up, I want you to immediately go, all right, multiplier effect, because I'm going to say this. I go, investment is a component of AD. So AD will shift outwards. Investment is also an injection into the circular flow of income. And so there will be a positive multiplier effect. Definition, by the way, this is the number of times the rise in national incomes exceeds the initial injection that's caused it. Nice and easy. And now, because I've talked about the multiplier effect, when I draw my aggregate demand, aggregate supply diagram like this, so this is real output, and this is price level, I can show off. Let me show you how you can show off. So imagine, sorry, that's not the nicest LRAS curve in the world, but it will do. Imagine initially this is aggregate demand, this is aggregate supply, so Y1, P1. The first shift is because consumption and investment went up, right? However, there's a second shift. Why? Because the second shift depicts the multiplier effect. That's a little kind of thing that you could do to show the examiner that you know what you're doing. Yeah, so that I then just summarize that. And this is where you bring it back to the question about the fact that it's a pandemic. It doesn't actually matter. They always do this where they add extra words into a question to make it seem a lot more scary than it is. Evaluate the appropriateness of using this at a time of this. Who cares about what time it is? That you just bring in at the end of the paragraph. The theory is exactly the same every single time. It doesn't change. So you go, okay, this causes economic growth to rise from Y1 to Y3, which could offset the negative impact of COVID, as consumer confidence is likely to have been quite low, or that it could result in, for example, job creation, etc. Right? So that's something along those lines. That would be the analysis, the first analysis. All right, let's chat. That is the analysis. And I said earlier, when we started this essay, that I did this because there is an outstanding evaluation. The outstanding evaluation is to bring in your real world knowledge with really, really A-star level evaluation and theory. This is the evaluation. There is a concept known as a liquidity trap. And you are going to use this on Monday. And this is how it works. A liquidity trap is a fancy way of saying monetary policy does not do anything, or that it is very, very ineffective. And the reason why this is a brilliant evaluation is because prior to the COVID pandemic, what was the base rate in the UK? It was 0.5%. They took it down to 0.25, I think, and then 0.2 or something, and then 0.1. Basically, in a nutshell, was the interest rate high before they cut it to 0.1? The answer is absolutely not. The interest rate was super duper low. In fact, since March 2009, the UK's base rate has not been above 1%. That's over 10 years ago. In other words, cutting the base rate down to 0.1% is kind of a meaningless gesture because in reality, most, if not all, commercial banks have probably cut their interest rates as low as they are willing to go. Further cuts to the base rate would therefore have practically no impact on the economy. If commercial banks aren't cutting their interest rates, I don't borrow from the Bank of England. You don't borrow from the Bank of England. Businesses don't borrow from. Who do you borrow from? You borrow money from the commercial banks. Therefore, if the commercial banks have reached their lower limit in terms of what they're willing to cut their interest rates to, this will do nothing. Now, sometimes I get this and people go, oh, what about if the central bank did negative interest rates? I'm like, okay, even that probably doesn't have that much impact. Japan tried that. The European Central Bank tried that recently with the Eurozone. Okay, hypothetically, let's say, in this made up example, so let me just get rid of the word liquidity trap for a second. Okay, so imagine this is the Bank of England. Yeah, this is the B of E. The rate that they set is called the base rate. So let's say, hypothetically, they decide to now reduce the base rate to 1%, okay? Now, if one of the commercial banks, let's just say HSBC, decide to borrow £100 from the Bank of England, do you agree that they now need to pay back eventually £99 to the Bank of England? Okay, but this is what the bank at HSBC do now. When they decide whether to lend or not, there is a risk tolerance because if they give out that £100 as a loan to an individual with a track record of not paying back their debts, and that person takes out the loan and then doesn't pay it back, HSBC have just now lost that money, right? In other words, they're making a loss in this case of £99 because they still have to pay £99 to the Bank of England. Therefore, are they just going to lend it out to any person that walks into the bank? No, obviously not. And actually, one of the things that they would consider is to go, okay, if the interest rate I charge an individual, let's say the rate I can charge an individual is 3%. That's the lower limit I'm willing to go to. If it starts to go below that level, let's say now the interest that I would lend out if I'm HSBC is 2%. Well, now I think of it in this way. I go, okay, what is safer? Me giving out a loan to this individual or this business at a 2% return? Or is it better for me to buy a government bond and get 2% return on a government bond? What's safer, a whole country or a business or an individual? Obviously the country, right? Obviously, if you have loads of money as HSBC now, you go, I'm going to just buy bonds with this money. Thank you very much for the negative interest rate. I'm just going to buy bonds. Why would I give out loans to individuals at the same rate as what bonds return in terms of interest? It doesn't make sense. Therefore, realistically, you could argue the commercial banks have cut their interest rates as low as they are willing to go. They're not going to cut them anymore. Therefore, this is just an empty gesture. The Bank of England cutting it to 0.1%, does it do anything? Probably not. That is an out. I know I said it, so it's a bit me being myself up, but it is an outstanding evaluation. And if you write that in the exam in the 25 marker, that's when you are properly into A-star territory. Because you're talking about, however, monetary policy may have been extremely ineffective. The Bank of England are likely to have suffered from a liquidity trap. This is where monetary policy becomes ineffective, as further cuts to the base rate have little to no impact on the economy, as commercial banks may be unwilling to cut their interest rates any lower than they already have cut them. To develop it in even more detail, by the way, you say the UK base rate, the Bank of England base rate, has not been above 1% since March 2009. Therefore, commercial banks are likely to have already cut their interest rates as low as they're willing to go, and thus cutting it further does nothing to the economy. Does that make sense? Hopefully that makes sense, because that's a really, really important point. That's the first half of the essay. The other half of the essay is so lovely and easy. The second half of the essay is to talk about fiscal policy and to talk about how the government adopted expansionary fiscal policy. What I will be talking about there is two things. One is the fact that the government adopted very aggressively expansionary fiscal policy in the form of furlough. So they provided they were paying up to 80% of wages for up to a certain amount of salary, but up to 80% of wages for staff to try and encourage the businesses to not sack those individuals, to not basically fire them. So that's the first bit I would develop. The other thing I would talk about very easily is they also created jobs. So for example, the test and trace system would have created jobs. I think they open that, what's it called, the Nightingale Hospital. I don't know if anyone got employed there, but probably hired a few more workers there. Also, there was the COVID, the vaccine rollout. They would have hired people there. In a nutshell, then you go, government spending is a component of AD. AD will shift out. Government spending is also an injection into the circular flow of income. Positive multiplier effect. Draw the diagram. I would focus my energy probably on unemployment for that particular paragraph to go, okay, unemployment could have been really, really bad during the pandemic, but the government intervention limited it. Evaluation, easy peasy. The evaluation is, however, the government spending large sums of money, fiscal deficit, up. National debt, up. The UK debt as a percentage of GDP is near 100% now. This may translate into a downgrade in the UK's credit rating. If that happens, the demand for UK government bonds, down. Price of government bonds, down. Yield, fancy way of saying interest rate, up. This increases the cost of borrowing for the UK government, which makes it harder for them to service, to basically pay off future debts. That essay is amazing now. Yeah. If that comes up on Monday, you're welcome. So that is that question hopefully answered, hopefully quite thoroughly. Right, let's have a look at the chat, see other questions. Right, I want to talk about protectionism pretty soon because that is high on my list. Okay, cool. One of the questions, just to address it because it pretty much is literally what we just discussed, is assessing two reasons why, or assessing reasons why the UK's fiscal deficit rose. Yeah, very straightforward. One is obviously if it's extract based, and it probably will be that type of question. You would have plenty of extract information about the furlough scheme and how much it would have cost the government. This obviously increases the fiscal deficit because the government, there's higher levels of spending. The second, by the way, is that the tax revenue the government are likely to have been generating during the pandemic would have obviously fallen for a number of reasons. There are three forms of taxes to consider. The first is income tax. So if people were being laid off, then income tax revenue would have gone down. Two is corporation tax, especially industries like the leisure industry, airline industry, those that are really badly impacted by COVID, their profits would have gone down to almost like probably losses, right? So the government would have collected less revenue in terms of corporation tax. And the last type of tax is basically indirect taxes. So like VAT, people obviously theoretically would have been spending less during the pandemic. Therefore, the government collect less tax revenue in totality. Yeah. All of this means the government fiscal deficit would worsen. Is that clear? Evaluations for things like that is you could talk about how the government could have mitigated how badly the fiscal deficit would have gone up by. For example, the furlough scheme would have meant that they may have needed to pay a little bit less in unemployment benefits because maybe people kept their jobs or businesses kept them in their jobs. And what else could you do about this? As the economy recovers, when the economy starts to recover, it will eventually basically start to reverse this and the debt can start to basically be paid off. Stuff like that. Yeah. Okay, right. A couple of other questions I will take. I'll answer as many of these as I can. Right, one of the questions is this. This is quite a small question, but it is on the advance notice. I do want to address this. Discuss two reasons why economic growth is inadequate as a measure of changes in living standards between countries and over time as well, by the way. Okay. This is one of those where it's got a set answer. I just want you to write the same thing every single time. So basically, why is GDP an inadequate measure? Why is it flawed as a measure of living standards? Whether it's GDP or GDP per capita, it doesn't make a difference. Okay, the best way to understand this is through this. Imagine me and one of you guys live on a deserted island, and let's assume that island is a country, yeah? And let's say that you earn £1 billion per year. I earn I earn £1 per year. What is our GDP? Our GDP is 1,000,000,001. If you do our GDP per capita, you divide that by 2. If my maths isn't embarrassing with that, I think it's like 500 million and 50p. Yeah, it's probably more than that, whatever, right? If you look at the GDP per capita of that economy, there you go, wow. These guys, their living standards are amazing. Is that true though? Well, obviously not, because you have £1 billion. You're living a life of luxury. I have £1. I'm dying. I'm in like major poverty here, right? The issue that I'm basically addressing then is that GDP and GDP per capita does not take into account income inequality. And for several countries around the world, India being the best example of this actually, the GDP value is the vast majority of the number is accounted for by a tiny percentage of the population. Therefore, it's not a true reflection of the living standards in that economy. The average person isn't actually living a good life. It's that the GDP looks a lot better because of the people that are like billionaires. India, I believe, have the highest number of billionaires in the whole world, and yet have some of the worst poverty in the world as well. So that's the first problem with using GDP as a metric of living standards. The second problem with using GDP is twofold. It's basically that it's undervalued, and there are two main reasons why. So especially in developing countries, but it doesn't have to be developing countries, there is a high level of what we call subsistence farming. Subsistence farming is a fancy way of saying the farmers, when they grow their crops, rather than selling the crops, they eat the crops, they consume it, they live off it. Now, that output is therefore not measured as part of GDP, but it should be because it's output. As a result, their GDP value is a lot lower than what the reality of their kind of situation is. Their living standards aren't that bad, but their GDP value will be really low. You're like, oh, wow, they're all dying. This is really bad. But actually, they're fine. They're just living off their crops. So that's the first issue, why it's undervalued. The second is the hidden economy. If a lot of transactions are taking place in the hidden economy, basically illegally, they're not measured as part of GDP, but again, it should be, technically, that's what GDP is. It's meant to be a measure of all the services and all the goods and services produced in an economy in a year. Well, again, the GDP isn't the best indicator then, because it will undervalue how good living standards are, or the true living standards in an economy. Fine? Two evaluations. First evaluation for a question like that is to basically say there is clearly a correlation between living standards and GDP, though. Yes, it may be imperfect and there might be problems with the measure, but ultimately it's pretty strongly correlated. Yeah, there are a couple of anomalies here and there, but if you look at like the countries that have the highest GDP per capita, and you look at their living standards, you look at their life expectancy, you look at like their access to education, you look at their resources, they're much higher than the countries that have really low GDPs. So there is merit to using GDP as a measure. The second evaluation is to basically talk about the fact that the data is very easy to collect for GDP, which makes it very easy to do comparisons globally. And all countries really collect data for GDP. It's very, very easy for them to do it. So that's useful in terms of why GDP is good. Is that clear? That's how you answer that as a 12 marker if it comes up, or even a 10 marker. Yeah? Okay, right. What sort of question could come up for macroeconomic policies in a global context? Okay. I think global context, in terms of what they mean by that, or the kind of things they tend to ask, is more likely to do with things like protectionism or the impact of globalization. So let's actually address that now. We'll come back to like government finances and debt and inequality and stuff like that. Let's deal with the question about protectionism and how you go about answering a question about protectionism. So let's say the question, if I actually get up my pack, let me give me 1 second. So those of you that are on the edXL board, by the way, your teachers should have access. I don't know if it's too late to get in touch with your teachers if you haven't got in touch with them. There is a locked specimen paper. So there's the normal specimen paper that everyone can see. And then there's a locked specimen paper for papers 1, 2, and 3. The locked specimen paper, paper 2, is really useful for you to do. There's a 15 marker to summarize what was happening. It was basically a trade war between China and the EU. The Chinese were being accused of subsidizing their mobile phone equipment sector, and as a result, the EU were threatening to put up major tariffs on that sector. Okay, so let's actually deal with that. Imagine I've given you the context of the question. Forget the data. Yeah, obviously you need data and you need to apply it, but I want to show you how you structure this. If the question says evaluate the macroeconomic effects of increased protectionism, in that case, between or evaluate the macroeconomic effects of the EU imposing a tariff on Chinese mobile equipment. The key word here is macroeconomic effects. The reason why that's important to zoom in on is because it doesn't specify in that question whether we're looking at it from the lens of the Europeans or the Chinese. If that is how they word your question, my advice is do both. It makes your life so much easier. So let's actually do this question, right? So imagine I've just said the EU have decided to impose a tariff on that particular market. What is the impact? So we're going to split it as the EU and we'll do China. Okay, the impact on the EU and the impact on China. All right. In terms of the analysis for the EU, you should hopefully know a couple of reasons why protectionism could be a good thing. Infinite industry argument, sunset industry argument, to prevent dumping, etc., etc. In a nutshell, the main things we're going to talk about for the EU side is that the protectionist policy means that there's a more level playing field, because the Chinese were being accused of getting subsidies, so their goods would have looked more price kind of attractive or more price competitive compared to the European firms. So in a nutshell, is it protects European jobs. Okay, it protects EU jobs. It's going to result in them having more revenue. They're going to sell more to the European market, the European firms, that is. And as a result, they can invest the profits, etc., etc. Right? So really the first analysis is pretty straightforward. You basically go, it's beneficial for the European side, the producers, because of the fact that it's going to result in job kind of retention. It's going to allow them to compete against the Chinese firms on a cost basis, on a price basis, more equally, and all of that. Right, evaluation. In order for me to explain the evaluation, I need to turn the page. There are only, for those of you that are doing edXL, and to be fair, even if you're not edXL, if you're doing like OCR, if you're doing AQA, Educast, there aren't that many diagrams in macro that you need to know ahead of the exam. I'd say for like edXL, there are four. There are four main diagrams that you need to know. Lorenz curve, Laffer curve, the tariff diagram, big time, which I'm going to draw right now, and then ASAD diagrams, which should be like second nature to you by now. All right, let's talk about what the tariff diagram illustrates. I need this to make complete sense. This is the best diagram in the whole of macro. So let's go through it together. The starting point is to draw standard supply and demand diagram. But rather than just drawing supply and demand, now if you don't know what the country is, you probably will, by the way, because of the data, you would write over here domestic and demand domestic. In other words, these are the producers within the economy, and domestic demand is the consumers within that economy. Now we know which country, or which, in this case, trading bloc is imposing the tariff. So we're going to write EU over here, and the demand over here is, again, the EU. Fine. One of the assumptions that we make about the tariff diagram is that consumers become price takers. The reason why is because this particular product, imagine you could buy it from anywhere in the world. Therefore, if anyone tried to charge even a penny more than what everyone else is charging, no one will buy it off them. So imagine the world price is initially here. So we have WP1, and this is the world supply. It's inelastic, perfectly inelastic. Sorry, not elastic, perfectly elastic. It's perfectly elastic because it basically says you can get this product at this price from anywhere in the world. Anyone can sell it to you at this price. Now, two things before we shift anything. One, look at where that world price hits this curve. And which curve is that? Well, that curve is the domestic supply. So the amount of producers making the good in the EU at that world price, right? Is that high or is that low? Hopefully you're shouting at your screen that this is very low, because can you see quantity there is 0. So hardly anything is being produced by the Europeans of this good at that price. Why? Why? The reason is because a supply curve maps out at different prices what a producer is willing to sell. So the higher the price, the more incentive I have to sell this good. Well, this market price of WP1 for European manufacturers is not that attractive. They go, no thanks, I'm not interested. They'll make some of it, so they'll make Q1 units, but they're not going to make that many units. Demand, on the other hand, is all the way over here, which is very, very high. Why? Well, the answer, again, is very straightforward. It's because the price is cheap. Consumers go, I love it. I want to buy loads of this. This is really cheap for me, right? Therefore, you now have a disparity between how much is demanded in the EU and how much is supplied by the producers in the EU. There's excess demand. Now, if you are a consumer in the EU and you really want to buy this product, where must you turn to buy the product? And I'm not talking about the hidden economy, by the way. Well, what I now turn to is imports. I buy it from abroad. So if European firms are only willing to produce Q1 units, but European consumers want Q2 units, the distance between these 2 points is the initial level of imports. Is that really clear? Because if I can't buy it from the domestic market, I'm just going to buy it from abroad. I can buy it from anywhere. I'm going to buy it from abroad. Yeah. So this is the initial level of imports coming in to the EU. Now the Europeans decide to impose a tariff in this market. So what happens? What happens now is the world price goes up and you have this world supply plus tariff. Okay. So a tariff, if you remember, is a tax on imports. Okay. Same exercise again. Now we have at that new world price, where does it hit the supply? Well, it hits it there now. So this is Q3. And it hits the demand. Actually, sorry, before we do demand, what happened to domestic supply? Can you see that domestic supply increases from Q1 to Q3? Sorry, I don't know how I zoomed in. From Q1 to Q3. Why? The answer is very straightforward, is the higher price is more attractive for European firms. They go, okay, if the Chinese firms are selling it at WP2 and we can now sell it at WP2 as well, fine. I can make more of this good. It's more attractive for me to make this good. Then we go to the demand curve, hits it there. And demand has gone clearly down from Q2 to Q4. Why? Because consumers can't afford to buy as much of the product at this higher price. Don't know why the colors are being weird on my board, but it doesn't matter. The new level of imports is therefore this, M2. Is that fair? Right. That diagram is still not done though. Every single time you draw the tariff diagram, I want you to now label the following. You're going to label this area A, this area B, this C, and this D. And this is what we're going to show. There are three players in every single economy. You have the consumer, producer, and then the government. And if we can show that the overall effect of a tariff is negative, that is one of the strongest arguments against it, and it is a strong evaluation for why it's a bad idea to impose this in the first place. So, three players, consumer as the starting point. If you guys remember from theme 1, the definition of consumer surplus is the difference between the maximum price a consumer is willing and able to pay for a good and the actual price that is paid for that particular product. Okay, 3-step exercise that will always enable you to calculate the consumer surplus area. Step 1, first to consumer, is it supply or demand? Well, obviously demand. What is the maximum price the consumer is willing to pay for this good? The maximum price is always where the demand curve for the consumer hits the price axis. You see that point there? That is the upper limit of what a consumer can afford to pay for this good. So that's my first dot, if you like. I'm going to literally put it as a dot, yeah? The second dot is to go, okay, what is the actual price that consumers initially pay for this product? Well, the initial price they pay for the product is WP1. So that's my second dot there. Cool. Then you always go across from that price until you hit the demand curve, because that's how many units they're going to be buying. So you go across from WP1 to the demand curve, it's there. Can you guys see my 3 dots, yeah? The initial consumer surplus area then is this area over here, where I've just, hopefully you can see it, yeah? All right, now let's do the new consumer surplus area following the tariff. Same exercise again. We go step 1. What is the maximum price consumers are willing and able to pay for the good? Has it changed? Well, no, because the demand curve hasn't shifted. So the maximum price is still this. Let's put an X. But what has changed is the market price. How much they actually pay for the product is now WP2. So this is the second, if you like, dot, or this cross, yeah? And again, I said, once I have the new price, or the price, I go across from that point until I hit the demand curve. So it hits the demand curve there. So to remind you, again, the initial surplus area was all of this, yeah? Now the surplus area is where the X's are. So here, here, there. What happened to consumer surplus? Hopefully you should be able to see quite clearly the consumer surplus fell by the area A, B, C, D. The consumer gets absolutely decimated in a tariff. It is so bad for domestic consumers when there's a tariff. So you go minus A, minus B, minus C, minus D. It's a catastrophe. The second player in an economy is the producer. The producer surplus, to remind you from last year, is the difference between the minimum price the producer is willing to sell a good for and what they actually sell it for. Okay, again, producer then is which curve? Supply or demand? It's obviously supply. So if I look at the supply from the EU perspective, because that's what I care about the producers in the EU here, the lowest price the producers are willing to sell the good for is there. Can you see that? Where the supply curve hits the price axis. So that's my first dot. You know, I'll do it as a square this time, yeah? As a square. And the second question is, what price do they initially pay for, or sorry, what price do they sell it for initially? Well, they initially sell it for the initial wild price WP1. This is my second square, if you like. Here we go. And then the last thing I do is I go across from that square, that price, until I hit the supply curve. So it hits the supply curve there. So this very small area here is the initial producer surplus, right? Same exercise again. So the lowest price the producer is willing to sell the good for, has it changed? No, it's still this over here. I'm going to circle it now. But what do they now receive as a price? Well, they now receive a price of WP2. So that's my second dot. And then I go across from that point until I hit the supply curve, which is there. Okay, so again, with my pen, the initial producer surplus area was this triangle. It's now this bigger area here. What happened to it? Well, it went up by A. So producer surplus goes up by A. Fine. The last player in an economy is the government. Now, whenever there's a tax, the government always receive revenue. And there are two things that you always need to be able to do to get the government tax revenue. So imagine it wasn't this, it was just a normal, like, let's say indirect tax on, let's say, packets of cigarettes. The two things you need to multiply are, one, what is the tax rate? How much are they taxing per packet? And two, how many packets are sold now? You can only tax what comes or what is sold after the tax is imposed. Well, here, what's the definition of a tariff? A tariff is a tax on imports. Well, the two things I therefore need to know is, one, what is the tariff? Well, I know that it's this. The height between these two supply curves, world supply and world supply plus tariff, is the tariff. The height of my area, therefore, is going to be that distance. What else do I need to know? Well, I need to know how many units are imported now, not before, now, because the government can only collect tax after they impose a tariff on what's imported now, right? Well, do I know the new level of imports? Of course I do. The new level of imports is the distance between Q3 and Q4. And look at what I just displayed. Q3, Q4, the width there, the heights between the supply curve and the supply plus tariff. What area is that? Clearly area C. So the government gain tax revenue of plus C. But what is the net effect? The net effect is that if we combine all of these together, do you agree if we apply some really basic maths? Minus A and plus A cancel each other out. Do you agree that minus C and plus C cancels each other out? What you are left with, though, is two welfare loss triangles of B and D. And there are two reasons why. One, the first is that consumers in the EU now have less choice and face higher prices. But the second reason why is because inefficient European firms that would not have survived under free trade are now kept in the market. Therefore, the quality of the goods being produced are also falling. Allocative efficiency, therefore, goes down. That diagram you are obligated to draw in your exam if they ask a question about protectionism. You have to do this. I need to understand it. Hopefully that made sense. Yeah. So if I go back to our master plan over here, literally the evaluation is consumers are so much worse off. Basically tariff diagram and welfare loss. Okay, especially consumers, right? European consumers are so much worse off because of this, and therefore it's not good for them to do this. That's the evaluation. Right, now we switch our attention to the other side, which is China. In terms of the analysis, very straightforward. What I would now do is I would go, okay, is the EU imposing a tariff on Chinese firms good or bad for Chinese firms? Well, obviously it's bad because their costs of production are going up. What's going to happen to their sales? Their sales are likely to go down, right? As a result, their export revenue is likely to go down. So export earnings likely to go down. Exports are a component of AD, or well, first actually before that, X minus M, their surplus, China's surplus is going to shrink. As a result, X minus M is a component of AD. AD therefore is going to shift inwards. You draw aggregate demand shifting inwards, summarize it, easy peasy, simple. Second analysis, done. Evaluation here is generic, and it will always work. When we're discussing whether the export earnings for Chinese firms are going to dramatically fall or only fall a little bit, there are 2 or 3 key things that I need to know. One, the first thing I need to know is I need to know the PED for Chinese goods, Chinese mobile phone equipment in the EU. If it's inelastic, imagine European consumers are really kind of addicted or like have really strong brand loyalty towards the Chinese firms. Then the increase in the price, which comes about due to the tariff, would result in a less than proportionate fall in demand for the Chinese firms. Therefore, is there going to be a dramatic decrease in their revenue? Not really. They can just shift it to the consumers. Go, all right, here you go. There's a tax. Here you go, guys. You pay it. Yeah. That's the first evaluation. It's a really strong eval. The second thing that I want to know is what proportion of their sales actually went to the EU. If it's a small amount, this is not a big deal. If it's a large amount, if it's their biggest market, then this is going to be a much more kind of like, it's going to hit them quite badly. So that's the second thing to consider is to go, oh, what proportion of their sales, so what percentage of sales are to EU? Yeah. The last, I mean, that's enough, by the way. That would get you 15 out of 15 comfortably. But the last thing that you can basically talk about here is that the idea that export revenue for the whole of China will go down because of one industry is a bit far-fetched. Like, it depends on what the other industries are doing. If their export earnings are rising in other industries that actually account for a larger percentage of overall exports, this is not a big deal. Yeah, this isn't going to impact them in the way that we've kind of described in the analysis. In our analysis, we're like really dramatic. Oh, it's going to produce aggregate demand and all of that. Probably not. Yeah, that's how you answer that question. Right. One more thing about protectionism before I move on to another topic and answer a couple of questions on the chat. In the 2017 paper, in fact, let me show you the 2017 paper. Let's open it together. So 2017, paper 2, right, I'll show my screen. Okay. In the 2017 paper, the 25 marker was, well, one of the 25 markers was this. Since the global, number 7. Since the global financial crisis of 2008, there have been over 5,700 increases in tariffs, quotas, and administrative controls on international trade. Evaluate the likely effects of an increase in protectionism on the economy of a developing country of your choice. Okay, for those of you that are at Excel, they obviously can't ask it about a developing country because development is in paper 3, not here. Doesn't matter. Let's just say like the impact on the UK or the impact. So not on the UK. Let's say the impact on the global economy. Let's broaden it out a little bit. Yeah. Now, if it says on the global economy, this is how I would approach it. To make my life easier, one half of my essay will be dealing with the impact on importers. So, for example, if you are a net importer of a particular product and the government imposes a tariff, you talk about how this is really beneficial for like infant industries. It could be really good for industries that kind of are struggling in the global market, like maybe they're sunset industries, preserves jobs and all of that. Same as I just did a second ago with the analysis for the EU. It'd be exactly the same thing, right? Then the evaluation would be, oh, but the tariff diagram, disaster. Imports, like tariffs are really bad for consumers. Consumer surplus goes down, welfare loss, blah, 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 all of that. I would then dedicate the second half of the essay to dealing with the impact on exporters. Firms or countries in this case that are exporters, this is going to hit them really badly. Because if there's suddenly more quotas and tariffs and protectionist policies in the global economy, their export earnings are likely to go down. It becomes the China question, by the way, if you notice. It literally is the same thing as what I just did a second ago. If I do it as global impact, that deals with it. Now, let's say instead it was actually specifically the impact on your country. So if there's tariffs on your country, this is how you approach it instead. By the way, so that just to be clear, the one that was global economy, once I do the extract about, or the part about the export earnings going down and AD shifting in, you evaluate it, or it depends on the PED. It depends on like how elastic the demand is for that country's products. If you think of countries like Germany, they have really strong brand loyalty because of companies like, Mercedes and Audi and Volkswagen and Adidas and etc. These are like really strong brands. Therefore, even if there was more tariffs, yes, it would impact them. But realistically, people probably will continue to pay a higher price for those type of cars because they're seen as quality competitive. Anyways, in a nutshell, in terms of the answer, if you were dealing with it from the perspective specifically of one country, you split it up between consumers and producers. So one analysis would be that it's going to protect producers and they're going to be better off. That would be the first analysis. And we can talk about like producer surplus area goes up by A and all of that. The evaluation to that, though, is that it might actually create a dependency culture amongst firms. If they become overly reliant on the domestic subsidy or the tariff or the quota or whatever protectionist policy it is that they've implemented, the quality of what they produce might actually start to deteriorate, and thus actually they become less competitive, and it's really bad. That's basically the bad thing. Yeah, so that's the first half. You go producers, good thing, producers, bad thing. Consumers, right, I would reverse it now. The mark scheme is very fluid. I start with the bad things. I draw the tariff diagram and go, this is disaster for consumers. It's so much worse for consumers because of the fact that they are now going to import a lot less, is going to pay more, and consumer surplus goes down, etc., etc., etc. Now, if I am really stuck in an exam, in a macro exam, especially, so on Monday, let's say you're stuck, you're like, I don't have an evaluation, I don't have a second evaluation. I can almost guarantee you the one thing that will always be there is short run versus long run. Is to basically say, oh, this might just be a short run thing. Maybe actually in the long run, the tariffs start to be removed. If, for example, the World Trade Organization intervene, it might be the case that consumers are pretty okay because they're going to remove the tariffs. It's okay. And if it's the case that, for example, the government are subsidizing domestic firms, yes, it's more expensive for me to import goods and services, but I might not even need to. I'll buy it from the domestic market because now prices in the economy are low. So I don't mind. So in other words, the impact on consumers depends on whether the government is subsidizing the domestic firms. If that's the form of protectionism, you go, well, that's not that big a deal because then it's cheaper for consumers as well. Or two is to basically say, oh, look, this might just be a temporary thing. Eventually, the WTO might intervene, the countries might resolve the trade dispute between them, and therefore the tariffs start to be removed. Is that hopefully clear? So that's, I hope protectionism now kind of wrapped up quite thoroughly and that you're happy to do that now in an exam. Right, what have we got? Okay, can we go through policies to reduce government debt? Yes, we can. So let's go back to government debt and how to deal with that. Okay, let's do it. Let me share my screen. This is actually quite an awkward question. This is not that easy to develop in detail. Sorry, wrong thing. Let me show my board. I think if they ask this, I'm hoping it's not a 25 marker, because I think as a 25 marker, this isn't great in terms of really being able to flesh it out in detail. I'd probably avoid if it came up as a 25. It's more likely to come up as a data response. A good question for you to look at, by the way, is Old Spec Unit 4, June 2016, question 4E. It's a question about Ghana. And the 15 marker in that exact extract is policies to reduce their fiscal deficit, okay? Now, a fiscal deficit, to remind you guys again, is where the government spending exceeds tax revenue in a year. So obviously, if you think about it, to reduce the fiscal deficit, you really have two options. There is a third kind of out there option, which I'll discuss later. But the two main things that you're going to talk about is either the government cuts spending or they raise taxes. That's it, really. Let's start with raising taxes. So number one analysis is going to be increased taxation. Now, the topic sentence would be, one way in which the government can reduce their fiscal deficit is by raising tax. I appreciate that you go, okay, how do I flesh this out? The way you flesh it out is by talking about the three types of taxes and each of them talking about raising them. One, first type of tax is income tax. The government can raise, for example, the top rate of tax, which in the UK is currently 45%. So if they raise the top rate of tax, this enables the government to generate more tax revenue and as a result, reduce their fiscal deficit. Two, second type of tax is corporation tax. They can tax businesses more. So at the moment, the corporation tax in the UK is 19%. If they were to raise it to, let's say, 22%, 23%, whatever number it is, the government might generate more tax revenue from companies and the profits that they're making. Three, they can raise indirect taxes, especially on demerit goods. I know that's micro, chuck it in, it's fine. So you could talk about, if they raise taxes on, let's say, addictive products like cigarettes and maybe diesel and petrol and things like that. Consequence of that is the government generate more tax. All of this paragraph is just about the government, therefore, collecting more tax revenue. If you do that as your analysis, I obligate you to do the following as your evaluation. You are to now evaluate using something called the Laffer curve. And this is what the Laffer curve looks like. So we have tax rates and we have tax revenue. Right. I need you to understand the Laffer curve in terms of the intrinsic kind of concept. If the tax rate in the economy was 0%, how much revenue would the government generate? Hopefully you're screaming at your screen, obviously nothing. If there's no tax, there's no revenue. What about if the tax rate was 100%? What if the government imposed a tax rate of 100%? What would the tax revenue be? Some of you might be saying 100%. It's not 100%. It's definitely not 100%. I can guarantee you that. And my question to you is basically this, is that, okay, if they were to impose a tax rate of 100%, would you work? No, you wouldn't work, probably not, because if the government says to you, whatever you earn, we'll take all of it, it's all ours. Therefore, theoretically anyway, the Laffer curve argues that when the tax rate is 100%, you actually make zero revenue. Hence the shape of the Laffer curve is this, okay? Now, whenever you draw this, I'd encourage you guys to, at the peak, dot down from there, let's call that T star. I'll talk about what that is in a second. And then over here is point A, and over there is point B. Yeah, I just pick any random points on either side of the Laffer curve so I can basically talk about them and go, oh, if we were here, this is what would happen. If we were here, this is what would happen. Yeah. So my starting point is basically to say this. It would be, okay, if the economy, so you go, however, for there to be an improvement in the UK fiscal deficit following an increase in the tax depends on where the economy initially is on its Laffer curve. Just spelled like this. Yeah. Then you draw it and you go, if the economy were initially operating at point A on the Laffer curve, then an increase in the tax rate would generate more tax revenue and thus reduce the fiscal deficit. In that case, no problem. However, if the economy were initially on the wrong side of the Laffer curve, now to be clear, I'm saying wrong side. Wrong side depends on what you're doing. In this case, it's the wrong side. B would be the wrong side because we're raising tax, so they would make less revenue. If they were cutting tax, then A would be the wrong side. B would be the correct side. Does that make sense? So you go, if the economy were initially on the wrong side of the Laffer curve, such as point B, then raising taxes actually results in less tax revenue for the government. Now, there's a really, really sound theoretical explanation for this. And if you can remember this, great. If you can't, just remember the next bit beyond this. The sound explanation is this, is that beyond the optimal tax rate T star, see that point there where tax revenue is peaking? Beyond that optimal tax rate, the supply of labor becomes elastic. What that means is every time the government raises taxes, of course, the number of hours people submit to HMRC is going to decrease because people have more incentive to tax avoid, evade. We'll talk about all those in a second. However, from 0 to T star, we assume the supply of labor is fairly inelastic. It will fall, but it's not going to dramatically fall. However, beyond T star, now suddenly there's a massive increase in the following three things. One, there's going to be an increase in tax avoidance. Tax avoidance, by the way, is the legal one. It's basically where you take advantage of like tax loopholes, or you might, for example, just reduce the number of hours that you work. Yeah, that's actually the easiest way to understand tax avoidance. So people just go, it's not worth working as many hours. I'm going to cut down my hours because the taxes are too high. One. Two is the illegal one. It might result in an increase in tax evasion. Tax evasion is where people purposely underdeclare their true earnings. They don't actually declare their full earnings to HMRC to avoid paying tax on those on that money. So that's two. The third thing that can happen, I wouldn't develop it in a question as a 12 marker because it's just you won't have enough time, run out of time. But let's say there's a bigger question, maybe a 50 marker, is that it might result in something called a brain drain. What's a brain drain? A brain drain is basically where the skilled, clever people in the economy migrate now to other countries where the tax rate is lower. They go, do you know what? Taxes are too high in the UK. I'm not interested. I'm going to leave. I'm going to go to France or wherever. Yeah. That all those three things come together to basically result in the government receiving not more revenue, but less revenue. That is a brilliant evaluation. You should know the Laffer curve really, really, really well and be comfortable using it whenever income taxes are going up or going down. Is that clear? So whenever you're dealing with like taxation and the impact of taxes and the impact on the fiscal deficit, you always should be evaluating with, or it depends on the Laffer curve. It depends where we are on the Laffer curve. Yeah, that's our first analysis. That's our first analysis and first evaluation. Second analysis is obviously reducing government spending. So cut government spending. Well, again, how do I flesh this out in any kind of substance and detail? Because it's not easy. Obviously, the extract will help. So you'll be quoting from it. So that's some application marks there. But the other thing that you can do is similar to what we did with tax. You could talk about the three types of government spending. The first type of government spending is called current expenditure. Yeah. So first type is called current expenditure. Current expenditure is a fancy way of saying day-to-day spending by the government on like salaries in the public sector. So whose salaries would the government be paying? Yeah. Well, the government pay the salaries of like nurses, doctors, teachers, blah, blah. So you give examples, you go, they could cut their salaries. I know that sounds awful, but like, that's one thing we could talk about. Yeah. The second thing that we could talk about, the second type of spending is called capital expenditure. So capital expenditure. Capital expenditure is basically spending on infrastructure. So things like hospitals, roads, schools, bridges, airports, whatever, right? So the government can cut down on that. Now, there's some real world application that you could apply here is HS2. Yeah, so HS2 is the high-speed rail in the UK. Well, if they were to cut down on that, or maybe don't go through beyond phase one of the project, that could save the money, the government a certain amount of money. The last is called transfer payments. What are transfer payments? Transfer payments is a fancy way of saying unemployment benefits. Yeah. So the government could reduce unemployment benefits, for example. And again, the consequences of that twofold. One is they get more revenue. So they spend less, so they don't spend as much. Two, though, is that actually reducing unemployment benefits might result in productivity levels in the economy going up, possibly, because there's a greater opportunity cost now of losing your job. If you lose your job now and unemployment benefits are lower, you're really, really like trying desperately to not lose your job. You're very desperate to keep your job and therefore hit targets and things like that. Anyways, in a nutshell, all of this is going to result in the fiscal deficit shrinking. Evaluation time. I have a stupendously good evaluation for you guys, and it is super high level. The fiscal deficit, in order for us to understand this evaluation, the fiscal deficit is actually made up of two parts. So if you zoom into a fiscal deficit, it actually is comprised of two components. Number one is called cyclical deficit. Right. Let's talk about what cyclical deficit is. What does the word cycle sound like to you? I assume that hopefully you're saying cycle. Let's get it. I was meant to say, what does cyclical sound like? Cycle, right? So which cycle do you know from theme 2? Well, the business cycle. The business cycle is basically this. So you've got GDP over here, and we have time over here. Every single economy has what we call the trend rate of growth, which is what it's expected to grow at on an annual basis if everything's going kind of according to plan. So this is like the trend rate. So as an example, the UK economy tends to grow on average since World War II, about 2 to 2.5% is roughly our trend rate of growth. The reality is that economies don't just move in a linear fashion. There's boom and bust. Oh, you've got this. Okay, so this is real GDP. This is the reality of what's actually happening in the economy. Okay, why is this important? The cyclical deficit is basically where the deficit adjusts when the government have not done anything. What I mean by that is imagine the government have not adjusted the tax rates and the government haven't adjusted how much you would get in unemployment benefits if you became unemployed, okay? But suddenly the economy falls into a recession. What will happen? Do you agree that automatically the government now collect less tax revenue through 3 channels? 1, there'll be less income tax because people are losing their jobs in a recession. 2, there'll be less corporation tax because firms' profits are likely to be falling in a recession. And 3, less indirect taxes like VAT because people are going to be spending less in a recession, confidence is low. So just immediately, the government receive less tax. Simultaneously, do you agree that automatically the government are now paying out more unemployment benefits because more people are unemployed? So the government, on the one hand, now collect less tax, and on the other hand, have to pay out more benefits. What will be happening to the cyclical deficit? Well, the cyclical deficit is obviously going to get bigger in a recession. Vice versa in a boom, by the way. If there's an economic boom, they collect more tax immediately, and they start to pay out less unemployment benefits because people are in a job now. Okay, so that's the cyclical deficit. It's where essentially the government don't do anything, and yet it has an impact all by itself, depending on where the economy is on its business cycle. So in a recession, economic growth falls, and therefore the cyclical deficit gets bigger. Right, the second type of deficit within the fiscal deficit is called structural. Structural deficit. If you think about it, if the cyclical deficit is where the government did nothing, they just didn't adjust the tax rates, they didn't adjust how much benefits you would get if you were unemployed, what is the structural deficit? Well, obviously the structural deficit is where the government are doing something, whether that's increasing spending, increasing tax, reducing spending, any of that, that is all going to impact the structural deficit. So for example, Rishi Sunak, when he spent loads of money on furlough, that would have increased the structural deficit. Is that clear? Because that's active government spending. So that's the structural deficit. Now, if we go back to our question over here, where we just said they should cut spending. This is the Genius evaluation. The Genius evaluation is to say the following, is to go, however, although cutting spending will reduce the structural deficit in the UK, because they're actively cutting spending, it is likely to worsen the cyclical deficit. Why? Because government spending is a component of AD. Therefore, if you cut government spending, AD is likely to shift inwards. You shift it in by, you draw it. As a consequence of AD shifting inwards, economic growth has fallen. If economic growth has fallen, do you agree that the government now are going to receive less tax revenue because more people are going to be unemployed, businesses are making less money, people are spending less in the economy, and they are therefore going to make the situation worse. So in other words, it might just cancel out. The cyclical deficit worsens whilst the structural gets better. Is it actually going to reduce the fiscal deficit? Who knows? It might not. Yeah, that is the way I would approach that question. Hopefully that addresses it quite well. At the beginning of this, by the way, I said there's like a bit of an outward, like a kind of thinking outside the box way of doing it, a third route. I wouldn't, but you can. What you can actually say as analysis is the government can spend more money. As crazy as that sounds, because obviously that increases the fiscal deficit. Because if you increase government spending, it creates jobs in the economy. So they start generating more tax. More spending translates into more profits for firms. Therefore, they hire more workers, more income tax in that way. They also generate more profits and more corporation tax. So you can go down that route and then evaluate by going, yeah, but the initial spending itself would have worsened the deficit. So it needs to be the case that the initial spending is lower than the amount of extra revenue they get from spending. So I don't mind. You can do that, but I probably would just focus on cut government spending, raise taxes, just do those ones. Yeah. All right. Cool. Hopefully you guys are not exhausted. Someone's asked about the multiplier. I did it right at the beginning of the session. So this is being recorded. It will be on YouTube. You can access it, I think, immediately after or within an hour. So just watch the beginning of the Q&A. I literally went through the multiplier. Yeah. Right. Can we go through? Right. It's not, no one's asked about this, but I do want to talk about it because it's important to understand. Income inequality and wealth inequality and understanding how to answer questions on it. First and foremost is to distinguish between wealth and income. Wealth is what we call a stock concept, which means that we can basically measure it at a particular moment in time. Wealth inequality then is basically inequality based on things like tangible assets, like housing, it could be shares, like you might own stocks and shares, or artwork. Yeah, these are all examples of wealth inequality. So some people own loads of like houses, some people don't own a single house. That's wealth inequality. Income is a flow concept, and therefore income inequality will be based on like income generated through like your wages, rental income, and dividends, right? Those are the main things to address. Okay, 2 things. First and foremost, I want to show you guys what I regard as the worst question that has ever been asked in the Edexcel spec. Let me pull this up. So it was in the 2012 Unit 4 paper, it's the old spec, Unit 4. They asked a very similar question to it again, though, in the June 2018 paper, paper 2. But let me just show you which question I'm talking about. Give me 1 second. So June 2012, right, share screen. Okay, right, here we are. So in the old spec, they had 2 sets of data responses. Here we go. The question that I have, that I'd like to talk about is this. It says, to what extent is income inequality an essential ingredient of capitalism? But if this comes up on Monday, I can assure you that at least 3/4 of the nation will be crying their eyes out, and it will be really bad. This is such a weird question. This is not normal. And I want to make sure that in the event that something wild like this comes up, you know how to address this. In a nutshell, capitalism is a free market economy. The complete opposite of it is obviously communism, where there's a command economy. And there are 2 main features in a capitalist economy or a capitalist society. Number one is private ownership of resources, that individuals can own assets. In a command economy, you cannot own anything. Everything is owned by the government. So even your house is not your house, it's the government, right? It's the state. So in a capitalist economy, the private ownership of resources. Now, that means that inevitably, those individuals that have more assets, that have more private ownership or more resources, if you like, will obviously be richer than those that have fewer assets. Is it therefore an essential ingredient? Absolutely, yes, it is. It's basically inevitable. What you'd say is it's the private ownership of resources means that those individuals who have more resources will have more money and be richer than those who have fewer. This, by the way, is wealth inequality, right? So if you own assets, that's wealth. Wealth inequality feeds into income inequality. And the reason is this, is that imagine I own several houses. Obviously, I'm not going to live in all those houses. What I will do is I'll be renting them out. Therefore, I'm generating a rental income. The person who's renting it off me, though, they're paying towards rent and they're struggling to save to buy the house and to buy their own house. So it's wealth inequality feeds into greater income inequality, which then feeds into greater wealth inequality. The person who's renting out their house and generating rental income is now saving up for a deposit to buy another house, right? So number one, the reason why it is an essential ingredient in income inequality is because it's inevitable given the private ownership of resources. People who have more resources are going to basically generate more income from those resources. Fine, that's one. I'll deal with the evaluations at the end in a moment. Second function or the second feature of a capitalist economy is the profit motive. And the profit motive is necessary as a means of encouraging entrepreneurs to take on the risk involved in setting up a business. When Jeff Bezos was setting up Amazon, do you think he was taking on that risk in terms of capital, financial capital, his time and all of that? If he thought, if it's successful, it's great, everyone in my company will all earn the same amount, it's fine, I'll just distribute it equally. Obviously not, right? Entrepreneurs are only going to take on the risk involved in basically setting up a business if they're going to be rewarded substantially more than the individuals that work on their behalf. So then again, the profit motive ensures pretty much guaranteed that there will be inequality in a capitalist economy. Because if those entrepreneurs' risks pay off and they translate into successful businesses, then those individuals will benefit substantially more than the individuals who they hire for their business, like Amazon. Yeah, those are your 2, hopefully, analyses that you deal with. The evaluations here, not straightforward, but if you look at the data, so the data basically shows for figure 1, the Gini coefficients between various countries. Just a quick tangent to just remember this by. So the Gini coefficient is the metric we use to determine the level of inequality in a country, right? The number for the Gini coefficient varies or ranges from 0 to 1, yeah? And often people get this wrong. They forget which one represents what. There's a silly way of remembering it. The number 1, what letter does it look like? Obviously, it looks like an I. This is therefore absolute inequality. Make sense? Absolute inequality. 0, therefore, obviously, is absolute equality. Yeah, so that's the scenario where everyone in the economy has the same amount of income. Yeah. Okay, right. Going back to the extract then, if I share my screen on that again. Can you see the Gini coefficients for these different countries? They vary, right? And these are all what we got, other than maybe China, the US, India, Britain, Japan, Germany, Sweden. We regard them as capitalist economies. So we go, well, actually, maybe the government can intervene to limit the extent of income inequality within a country. For example, if they implement progressive tax systems. So progressive taxes are taxes whereby the more you earn, the more tax you pay, then that might help to reduce the level of income inequality because they can take money from the highest earners in the economy and redistribute it to provide, for example, free resources to those who are most in need, like free healthcare, as an example, right? And this is evidenced by the fact that Sweden has a Gini coefficient of approximately 0.22, 0.23 maybe, compared to the USA, which is nearly 0.4, like 0.38, 0.37, whatever. Yeah? No, sorry, yeah. Okay, so that basically is the first evaluation. Second evaluation is to basically talk about policies that the government could implement other than that. So you could go, oh, they could invest into education and training schemes to reduce the level of income inequality in the long run. If they provide, let's say, free education for those from low income backgrounds, or provide them with like grants and subsidies and all of that, well, that can help to bridge the income inequality in a gap, despite them being a capitalist country. Is that clear? Hopefully that addresses it quite nicely, I hope. Right, what other questions do we have? Government intervention markets. Okay, when you say government intervention in markets, what do you mean? Do you mean like, so government intervention in a macro lens is literally monetary policy? If it's, well, not government, that would be like, if it says macroeconomic policies, otherwise it's fiscal policy and supply side policies. Really quickly to whiz through a couple of supply side policies, by the way, in case they try to be a little bit evil. Supply side policies are basically policies aimed at trying to increase the productive capacity of an economy. And they're broken down into what we call market-based strategies and interventionist strategies. The way to decipher which is which is interventionist, from the name, is where the government are actively intervening to try and like fix the problem maybe. For example, if they invest into education and training programs, that is interventionist. And that is obviously a clear supply side policy. A market-based strategy is where they back off. For example, if they reduce corporation tax, that's an example of a market-based strategy, because it means that they're leaving the firms and trusting them with their profits. They go, you can kind of use your profits. Yeah. Okay. Right. Evaluate the causes of income inequality. Okay, cool. Let's quickly talk about that just out loud. Yeah. So income inequality, as we talked about, is caused by a multitude of factors. The two main things that I would probably be discussing here, by the way, is I would be talking about inheritance. Why? Because inheritance means that individuals who inherit assets are in a position where if there's a financial downturn, they're less impacted because they can fall back on those assets, but they also derive more income from that wealth. So in other words, if you own, let's say your parents hand down for you 3 or 4 properties, you rent out, a handful of them, if not all of them, and you now generate rental income. And that rental income ensures that you have more income compared to someone that doesn't have the asset because they're not generating rental income. Nice and easy, yeah? So that would be my first analysis. I would evaluate that by talking about, but government can implement things like inheritance tax to limit that. They can also implement schemes like Help to Buy to try and get people onto the property ladder, to get them to actually be able to afford an asset so that it can bridge the gap in terms of income inequality. That would be number one. Second half of the essay, it could be like access to education. So in the UK, for example, tuition fees in universities went up pretty dramatically a couple of years ago. They were on average about £3,000 per year. It's now about £9,000 a year. That obviously prices out low income backgrounds. And education is one of the biggest causes, or a lack of education, in terms of income inequality in a country, because the more educated you are, the more wage inelastic the demand is for your service. Because if you have high skills, you are much harder for the firm to replace with like capital machinery. You're much harder to replace with another worker because there's not many of you, right? So let's say you develop, you become a neurosurgeon as an example, right? You're almost indispensable to the firm, to the hospital here, and therefore you can command a much higher wage compared to someone that hasn't gone to university, who doesn't necessarily have the same skill set, isn't able to basically hold down a job in the same way you are. Yeah, there was a stat, and it might be outdated by now, but you can use it. In the June 2013 theme Unit 1 old spec paper, it was about university fees going up. It said on average, an individual is expected to make an extra £160,000 over a working lifetime compared to someone that has just A levels, that just doesn't go to university. So that could be some nice real world stat. Evaluation to that is, however, the government could intervene and basically provide education and training programs. It's that they could invest loads of money to especially low income, kind of deprived regions of the country, to ensure that they actually can go to university. They subsidize it through like grants to encourage people to go to university. And you can even bring in the fact that technology can start to bridge that gap. You have people that can educate you, right? So that hopefully means that you get access to, the best quality education out there, and it's not a question of being, having huge amounts of money. Okay, that's basically how I would deal with that question, and that's your one analysis and your evaluation. Right, one of you is asking about one of the questions in my pack about taxation. I made up a question about Turkey. All right, let's deal with it. It's a very easy question to deal with. It says this, it goes, in 2020, Turkey introduced a new top rate of tax of 40%. Evaluate the macroeconomic effects of an increase in taxation. Okay, we've actually kind of dealt with this earlier today, but let's go through it. Number one, Firstly, by the way, it's specifically income tax and specifically that they raise the top rate of tax. Yeah. My first analysis, if I was answering this question, is to talk about how this ensures, or this should translate into more tax revenue for the government. More tax revenue for the government means that the fiscal deficit for Turkey may go down. If their fiscal deficit shrinks, their national debt as a percentage of GDP might also go down. And then you enter into our wonderful chain of reasoning to go, this might result in an upgrade in their credit rating. If their credit rating improves, as a result, the demand for Turkish bonds might go up. The price of Turkish bonds might therefore go up. The yield, the interest rate on the bonds might go down. This makes it easier for the Turkish government to service future debts because their cost of borrowing is lower. That's our first analysis. The evaluation easily is the Laffer curve. You draw the Laffer curve and now basically talk about, oh, actually, raising the top rate of tax might not necessarily result in more revenue for the Turkish government. It might result in less. You properly flesh it out and explain it. You go, if they're at point B on the Laffer curve, then an increase in the tax rate actually worsens the fiscal deficit. More tax avoidance, more tax evasion, brain drain is 25 markers, so go in. You go, oh, brain drain, people might migrate to another country because they think it's not worth staying in Turkey if the taxes are really high. That's one half of the essay. Yeah, nice and easy, hopefully. Second half of the essay in terms of what you could do. Well, you're spoiled for choice. Let's do it as, we're doing a good thing or bad thing. I did a good thing as an answer. Let's do a good thing again, I don't mind, right? If you increase the top rate of tax, what does that do to income inequality? It bridges income inequality. You now draw a wonderful Lorenz curve. Right, let's draw it together. And it's one of those where it's shifting. Yeah, so Lorenz curve, the most common error when it comes to the diagram is that people label income and population the wrong way around. There's an easy way of remembering this. What letter do we depict income in? Like, what letter do we use to depict income in economics? Or if you think about like YED from theme 1, its income is Y. Yeah. Therefore, it's always on the Y-axis. Is that clear? If let's say your maths is not your friend and you can't remember between Y-axis and X-axis, got you anyway. Don't worry. Income is what letter? It starts with an I. Here you go. This is your I. Yeah, it's that. That means it's on this axis. So you have cumulative share of income. So if I basically have all the incomes in the economy, and remember to always put percentage in brackets, yeah? Then we have cumulative share of population. And again, as a percentage, yeah? The starting point, whenever we draw the Lorenz curve, is we draw a 45-degree line like this. You see that line over there? For those of you that are kind of mathsy, you should know that that is obviously Y is equal to X. For those of you that are not mathsy, basically, every single unit, so if let's say this was 5% over here, that would be 5% there. If this was, let's say, 15%, that would be, I mean, that's probably not the scale, 30%, right? The numbers are the same on both the Y-axis and the X-axis. What is that line then? That line is called the line of absolute equality. If we were operating on that line, that would mean every single person in the economy has the exact same share of income. Obviously, that's not going to happen. In other words, then, to understand the Lorenz curve, the further away we are from that 45-degree line, the more unequal our society is. So if we have initially, let's say, Turkey's Lorenz curve like this, let me extend that. So that will be the first starting point. That's what the Lorenz curve would look like. Now, we've just said in our analysis that a higher rate of tax on top earners will reduce income inequality. Therefore, we're moving closer to the 45-degree line. Yeah. So now, let's shift it inwards and make sure you do an arrow to show the examiner which direction you're shifting it in. Yeah, that is now the diagram. And then if you remember, I talked about the Gini coefficient ranging between 0 and 1. What will happen to the Gini coefficient? Well, the Gini coefficient will fall. Yeah, if there's less income inequality, if the society becomes more equal, the Gini coefficient decreases it gets closer to like 0. Yeah, that's your analysis. Second evaluation is the bad thing is about raising tax. Unbelievably easy. If you raise income tax, do people have more or less disposable income? Top earners in the economy now have less disposable income, right? If they have less disposable income, are they going to spend more or less? Less. Consumption, the biggest component of AD is going to shift inwards. Draw it, summarize it, economic growth goes down, and the consequences of negative growth, all the bad things like unemployment is going to go up, and yeah, it's not great, basically. Yeah, hopefully that answers your question, hopefully quite thoroughly. Right, we are basically almost out of time. I'll quickly just go through one or two more things. Advantages and disadvantages of trade, like in specialization trade. Okay, so broadly, the benefits of globalization. One of the best benefits that you talk about in terms of globalization is comparative advantage. It's a very, very powerful theory. if you guys don't mind staying a little bit longer, I mean, you can leave anytime if you want. Can I just quickly address this? Because I want to just show you guys the mathematical way of dealing with questions about comparative advantage. Let's do it like this. Okay, so ignore the concept for a second. So comparative advantage, so really quickly, is where a country has a lower opportunity cost in the production of a good or service relative to another country. Yeah. All right. So the best way to understand this is through the following examples. This was taken from Unit 1, so it had nothing to do with comparative advantage, but it's all about opportunity cost. The Unit 1 June 2013 paper, question number 1, had the following. So it had bedrooms, had bathrooms, and then we had the following: 2, 4. This was Bob, 4, 2, Wendy. Okay, Bob and Wendy. In hindsight, I now know that this is about Bob the Builder. Didn't realize at the time, but here we go. Anyway, so in a nutshell, I want to now be able to calculate the opportunity cost of them producing either a bedroom or a bathroom. And there's a method to always do this that I want you to follow. But firstly, opportunity cost, if you remember from theme 1, is the value of the next best alternative foregone. In other words, what you sacrifice when you produce one more unit of a good. It is imperative to understand that you must express opportunity cost in terms of the other good. In other words, if I want to know what the opportunity cost of making a bedroom is in this example, my answer must be expressed in terms of bathrooms. It has to be, okay? So let's do bedrooms, and let's do like Bob. Yes, if I put Bob over here, this method is how you should lay out your working out to make sure you never get it wrong. On the left-hand side of your equation, if I want to calculate the opportunity cost of that thing, put it on the left-hand side. So you go, okay, bed on the left, bath on the right. All right, and my first question to you is this. If Bob does nothing but produce bedrooms, how many bedrooms can Bob make? Well, clearly Bob can make 4 bedrooms, right? So this is my first number, 4. If Bob did nothing but bedrooms, how many bathrooms would he have sacrificed? How many bathrooms would he therefore have given up? Well, can you see it's 2, right? He could have made 2 bathrooms, but he'd be making nothing. Therefore, the opportunity cost for Bob of making 1 bedroom, right? Because I want to express it in terms of 1. I want to go, for every 1 bedroom he makes, how much of the other thing does he give up? Well, how did I make 4 become 1? I divided it by 4. So 4 divided by 4 is obviously 1. I need to do the same thing to the other side of the equation. So I go, okay, 2 divided by 4 is equal to 0.5. In words then, the opportunity cost for Bob of producing 1 bedroom is 0.5 bathrooms. That is what his opportunity cost is. Right, let's do the same thing for Wendy. So I'm going to again write bed, bath. Right, if Wendy does nothing but produce bedrooms, how many bedrooms does she make? Well, she makes 2 bedrooms. How many bathrooms would she sacrifice? Well, she would sacrifice 4 bathrooms. And therefore, the opportunity cost of her making 1 bedroom, because I want to express it as 1, what did I do? I divided that number, which is 2, by itself. So I need to divide the other side by 2 as well. 4 divided by 2, obviously, is 2. In words, the opportunity cost for Wendy of producing 1 bedroom is therefore 2 bathrooms. Fine? Okay. I implore you, by the way, I'll talk about why this is powerful in a second. The specimen paper, for those of you that are at Excel, the unlocked specimen, you can find it on our website for paper 2, question number 5, question 5B. It has an extra or a PPF with Zambia and I think Colombia. It's like copper and emeralds, I think it is. Make sure you know how to answer that, because I think there's a very strong chance that you're going to get that in section A of your exam on Monday. Anyways, in this context over here, the concept of comparative advantage is basically that you should specialize in the good or service that you have a lower opportunity cost in the production of. Here, clearly, Bob has a lower opportunity cost in the production of bedrooms because he only gives up half a bathroom compared to Wendy gives up 2 bathrooms. Now, it's pretty obvious based on the numbers that Bob therefore should specialize in bedrooms and Wendy should specialize in bathrooms, fine? So let's say they do that now. So if I, by the way, reverse the numbers, if I did the opportunity cost of bathrooms and bed, they would just be the inverse. So yeah, you can obviously do that in your own time. But anyways, so let's say Bob now specializes and makes 4 bedrooms and Wendy specializes and makes 4 bathrooms. What is the logical trade that they should now engage in? What should they do? Do you agree it makes sense for Bob to give Wendy 2 bedrooms and Wendy to give him 2 bathrooms? So they end up with 2, 2. Look at the point 2, 2. If I go up from here and I go across from there, there. What do you notice about the point 2, 2, 2 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms? Do you notice that it is outside of both Bob and Wendy's PPF? they were incapable of reaching that outcome level by themselves. This is why the theory of comparative advantage is so powerful. It's because it illustrates that by basically specializing in what you have a comparative advantage in and then trading, you can reach outcome levels beyond your PPF, which is so powerful. This is why we describe it as like a huge benefit of globalization. When countries remove barriers to trade, because the whole theory hinges on there being free trade, they can tap into their comparative advantage, they can specialize, they can then trade, and this results in a more efficient allocation of resources. It enables a country to generate export-led growth. It enables consumers to get more choice, to get lower prices, to get better quality. All of these things are benefits of globalization, yeah? So that is the good things about globalization. The bad things about globalization, one, its countries become far too interdependent upon one another. So for example, the 2008 financial crash, it started off as a housing market crisis in the USA. It spread all over the world so quickly to the point where economies still haven't really fully recovered from that. Then you have more recently the COVID pandemic. The pandemic spread so rapidly because of globalization, because of the fact that there's so much international travel, so much international business, people moving around. Therefore, COVID spread way more than it would have, let's say, 100 years ago. Is that clear? That's the first bad thing about being too interdependent upon one another. The other bad thing about globalization is exploitation of like workers, especially in developing economies. Like TNCs have been kind of notorious for like going in there, taking advantage of the very limited amounts of regulation or no regulation, paying minimal to no, like very low wages in really bad kind of conditions and all of that. Okay, right. So hopefully that answers that as well. Thank you guys very much for tuning in and for your questions. It was really lively. I hope that was helpful. Good luck for your exam on Monday. I'm sure you'll do very, very well. And I haven't yet decided on paper 3. I hope I will have time to do one next Friday, probably about a similar time to this, but we will let you guys know in due course. Thank you guys very, very much.